At this time, his right to testify or not testify?
Not at this point in time, Your Honor. We have to, we're trying to get a understanding from the court as to the parameters of the waiver of the privilege. Is he waiving, if he testifies about the murders, is he then subject to cross-examination about the financial crimes? That's what we're asking.
All right. Mr. Waters.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. First of all, obviously the general rule is that cross is generally wide open, and that goes for a defendant who testifies. Your Honor, Rule 611B on the scope of cross-examination expressly says that a witness may be cross-examined on any matter relevant to any issue in the case. And of course, Your Honor has ruled through 404 and 403 the financial matters independently relevant. But the rule goes on to further say, including credibility. So even if that had not happened, these matters, which go right to the heart of the credibility and frankly the extensive dishonesty of this defendant, would be relevant if he took the stand anyway, regardless of the 404. So independently under that rule of the credibility aspect, it would be admissible under Rule 611B. But again, Your Honor has ruled these matters as relevant in the case, and so they're clearly within the scope of cross. Your Honor, citing State v. Gilbert and Gleaton, 273 SC 690, they said right there, as I think the defense recognized, when the accused takes the stand on his own behalf, he waives his privilege against compulsory self-incrimination and must answer all proper questions. Your Honor, Taylor v. State, which I believe may have been overruled on other grounds, but 258 SC 369, when the appellant elected to testify, he waived his right against self-incrimination and became subject to cross-examination like any other witness. And then finally, citing the U.S. Supreme Court, Brown v. U.S. 356 U.S. 148, it says, it's talking about a defendant in a criminal case. It says if he takes the stand and testifies in his own defense, his credibility may be impeached and his testimony assailed like any other witness, and the breadth of his waiver is determined by the scope of relevant cross-examination. He has no right to set forth to the jury all the facts which tend in his favor without lying himself open to a cross-examination on those facts. Those are the general and well-established rules, Your Honor, and they're particularly relevant in this case, and so we believe that those financial matters would be well within the scope of this particular matter and authorized by the rules in the case law.
Mr. Griffin.
Yeah, just briefly, Your Honor, with regard to credibility, the rules are pretty strict as to what evidence of criminal conduct can be used to impeach a witness's credibility, and there are limited to convictions, and that's Rule 609. Your Honor has let the financial evidence in under theory of motive, and you've done a 403 weighing test. And Your Honor, I think when you get to cross-examination of a defendant, I think Your Honor has discretion under Rule 403 to prohibit the state from further inquiry in this case on the financial evidence, which they contend is a motivating factor for the crimes. And that's and so the Brown v. U.S. and all the, I don't disagree that that's the black letter law, but the question is, what's the scope of cross-examination? And here he's charged with murder. He's not charged with financial crimes. He's charged with murder. And we're asking the court to limit the waiver of his Fifth Amendment privilege to the murder charges.
Yes, sir.
Again, moving back to 607, of course, the credibility of the witness may be attacked by any party. 608B allows examination, a cross-examination of a witness concerning their aspects of truthfulness and untruthfulness, which this clearly goes to, as well as 608C, which talks about bias, prejudice, and any motive to misrepresent. And again, we're not just talking about purely dishonesty and credibility, which I think is alone more than enough. We're also talking about examination on issues that are specifically relevant to this particular case based on the 404 ruling.
Rule 607, Rule 608, particularly the portion of 608, see evidence of bias, prejudice, or any motive to misrepresent may be shown to impeach the witness, either by examination of the witness or by evidence otherwise adduced. Rule 611 and 609 also addresses the issue. I am not going to issue an order in advance limiting the scope of cross-examination. Any objectionable matter must be addressed as the evidence is presented and not based on any advance ruling by the court.
Your Honor, the request for the ruling is not an evidentiary ruling. It's the scope of his privilege. And so would he be permitted to assert the Fifth, for example, if they're permitted to ask questions such as they intend to on cross? And that's...
I can't give you any advisory opinions about the evidence and the scope of cross-examination, the scope of his privilege. I'm willing to review with him the scope of his privilege against self-incrimination, if that's what you're referring to.
We will certainly need to have that colloquy at some point at the end of the day, perhaps. But
for the court to issue some blanket order limiting the scope of cross-examination, that's unheard of to me.
Again, Your Honor, I'm not, the question is the scope of the waiver of his privilege when he gets on that witness stand. That's what we're asking for, not an evidentiary ruling.
Well, Mr. Waters has some cases there that I assume he'd like for me to look at, and and if you do, I'd be happy to look at what you have as well.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Anything else?
Nothing from the state, Your Honor.
Nothing from the defense, Your Honor.
Let's bring the jury.
Jury is present, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Madam Forelady, how's the jury doing? Doing great. Well, that's great news. Well, we're now in day number 22, the defense's case. You may call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Mark Ball.
Do you swear affirm the testimony that you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Have a seat on the stand. Please adjust that microphone. You can speak into it. You'll state your full name and spell your last name.
Mark Ball, B-A-L-L.
Mr. Ball, will you tell the jury a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? What do you do?
I'm a lawyer in Hampton. I practice with the Parker Law Group now. I've lived in Hampton for 20-plus years. I now live in Rum Gully here in Colleton County. Have for about 8 years, 9 years. I practice mostly
How
civil
long
law.
have you been a lawyer?
33 years.
Okay. And where were you born and raised?
In Ballantyne, South Carolina, up above Columbia, about 20 miles.
And when did you move down to this part of the state?
I started with the law firm 34 years ago. I moved down. I was a law clerk at first and have never left since 1988.
Do you know the defendant, Alex Murdaugh?
I do,
How long have you known him?
34 years.
And did you practice law together?
We did, about 20-something.
Did you become personal friends of his?
Yes, I mean,
And were your family friends with his family?
yes, our children grew up together, as did everybody in the firm.
And your wife, Lisa, would she become good friends with Maggie?
Yes, sir.
Okay. On the, do you remember the evening of June the 7th,
I do very well.
2021?
Yes, sir.
How did you learn about the tragic murders of Maggie and Paul?
It was about 10:30, and one of my partners, Ronnie Crosby, tried to call my phone, and before I could get to it, he called my wife's phone, and he said, hand mark the phone, and he said Maggie and Paul had been shot and get over there. And so I scrambled and got over there. I live about 8 or 10 miles from there. I live over in Rum Gully, and that's Moselle.
And why did you go over there?
To find out what was going on, to see what was, I mean, we're out in the middle of nowhere, and somebody calls you and says your law partner's wife and child have been shot. You go. I mean,
And who did you go with?
I went with my wife Lisa.
And when you got there, who was on the scene? Do you recall?
Yeah, I came in by the cabin, what's referred to as the cabin side of it, and there was a ambulance was pulled up next to what I would call the hangar building. It was pulled up there, and then Barry McRoy's vehicle, he drives a SUV of some type, and then there was a police car pulled off to the right-hand side, probably 50 yards before you get to them, and I pulled in right behind them on the left-hand or the right-hand side of the driveway coming in, and then walked over.
Will you remind the jury who Barry McCoy is?
Barry McRoy is the chief of the fire and rescue here in Colleton County.
So when you arrived, I think Barry McCoy was present?
He was there. He was standing there speaking with a deputy, and there were 2 EMT paramedics standing over near their ambulance.
And when you pulled into the, I guess the lower driveway by the cabin, had any roadblocks or barriers been put up to stop cars from coming in there?
None. I got there about 10:50, 10:52, something like that.
Did you have a conversation with any law enforcement officers about the need to block the entrance?
I did eventually. I was talking to Barry about, I had found out just before I got there, somebody had called me, and they work with sort of the maintenance side of fire and rescue, and they had come across the radio that there were 2 dead. So I suspected that Paul and Maggie had passed away. So when I got there, I was talking to Barry and asking him some questions. I could see Randy kind of through the alleyway between the dog kennel and the sort of wing shed that comes off of the hangar. And then Buddy Hill, the sheriff, came over, and then I spoke with him.
And did you talk about the need to block the entrance into the Moselle property off Moselle Road?
We did just briefly. He said, I need to get this blocked off. And I think he took a phone call or something. And I walked back to tell my wife what was going on. And I saw another deputy coming in, so I walked out to the head of the road there, and I said, I think the sheriff wants this blocked off. And then I walked back to where Barry McRoy was. And then
did that entrance get blocked off?
No.
What happened?
People just kept piling in. I mean, it was just more and more people kept showing up.
Roughly how many cars do you think piled in?
I don't know, because shortly thereafter I walked around to the other side, but there were a good many. When I walked back over there an hour and a half later, there were a good many cars over there.
And when you say you walked around the other side, I don't think we need a diagram, but just tell the jury what you're talking about.
Well, there's a dog pen. From where I was standing, the dog pen would be to the left. The aircraft hangar with 2 wing sheds coming off of it would be directly in front of me. There's a skinning shed that would be to the far right, and then directly across from the hangar shed, probably 50 or 60, 75 yards, would be another storage shed, equipment shed. And so I walked down almost to where the skinning shed was, and then back around in front of the far shed, the equipment shed.
So you did not walk directly between the shed and the kennels?
No, sir.
You walked around the shed?
Correct.
Before you walked around the shed, did you stand and observe what was happening within the taped off area?
I did. I mean, people were walking between the dog pen, and the law enforcement and responders had walked between the 2 areas, the wing shed and the dog kennel, and I could see where Paul was, but he was covered up. Barry had covered him up.
And what was the weather?
It was misty. It wasn't really raining, but it was one of those kind of foggy days or nights that it's more than just a fog. You get wet, and eventually it got where it would drizzle off and on, and later on it didn't rain hard, but it would intermittently sprinkle in that kind of floating heavy fog.
Did you make any observations about water coming off the roof of the kennels?
I did later on when I got around to that side.
Okay, and what observations did you make?
Eventually the water was running off. That dog kennel is built with a small cantilever on the front of it, and then a longer part off the back, and water was dripping off of the front of the shed where Paul was.
Was water landing on Paul?
It was.
And could you see where the water would then accumulate after it landed on Paul?
It would drain off. There's a cement apron right there in the front of that feed room, and there was water there. There was water in the gravel to some degree. The grass was wet. I mean, it wasn't raining so hard that you couldn't just stand there without an umbrella, but it was drizzling enough that you were getting wet.
And the fact that you observed water dripping off the roof onto Paul's body, did that concern you?
It did. It did.
Why?
Well, one, I didn't think that, it's a crime scene. You don't want just water dripping all over the place, but more importantly, I thought it was pretty disrespectful. I mean, Paul was a good young man, and quite frankly, it just pissed me off.
I understand. Did you have a conversation with anyone about trying to prevent that?
I don't think I did about that aspect of it, but I just thought that they should have put a tarp or something. I mean, just out of respect.
Right.
They eventually did with Maggie put what I would call a tailgating tent, very similar to the media tents that are out front, those little lightweight, and they put that over Maggie.
Right.
To my knowledge, they never did over Paul, at least while I was there.
When you walked around the shed to get on the other side, who was on the other side?
Well, I could see through the alleyway between the dog kennels and that wing shed coming off of. If you were standing in front of the aircraft hangar, it'd be the right-hand side where Maggie was. I could see Randy over there and Alec. Alec much more infrequently, but Randy was on the phone walking, and I could see him. And I think he and I got there about the same time. He had come through the main gate.
When you got up, what did you get up to greet Alec?
I did. When I walked around, Alec met me about halfway where that equipment shed is, Alec came, as soon as he saw me coming up through there, he met me about halfway in front of that shed and just went to pieces. He's Alec's 6'4", 6'5", whatever he is, and I'm 5'9". He pretty well smothers you when he hugs you. And
What was his demeanor?
he was devastated. I mean, he was crying. He was, I mean, just beside himself. And I told him we'd get through it. And he, go ahead.
Yeah, eventually did SLED arrived on the scene?
He did, but while Alec was
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
kind of, you know, I'm trying to console him and patting him on the back, and, you know, he said, look at what they did, look at what they did to them. I mean, just right off the bat.
So during that initial encounter with Alec, he referred to they, look what they did, is that correct?
Yeah, they, which I didn't really think about at the time until I was taking my wife home. I just thought it was an odd comment.
The SLED arrived sometime later?
They did.
Do you remember about how long after your initial arrival SLED got on the scene?
I think they came kind of in, you know, because I'm sure they were coming from various locations, but they were there probably within an hour and a half of me being there.
And by the time SLED arrived, were there other members from your law firm and family members out on the property where you were standing?
There were. By the time SLED got there, pretty much all the lawyers in the firm, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3, one of them had small children, and one got forgotten, and pretty much everybody that was a lawyer was there. And family members, all of Alec's family was there.
Were you directed to leave the area when SLED started processing the crime scene?
Eventually we were. The coroner came over, Rich Harvey, came over and said SLED was there. They were ready to start processing the scene. He said, y'all need to, you know, go over to the house, and I said, are you sure about that? And he said, yeah. And I said, are you sure it's okay for us to go to the house? And he walked back over and asked somebody and came back and said, yeah. And I said,
did you have any concerns going to the house?
I did.
What were your concerns?
Well, it's twofold. One, you know, this is a pretty big farm, and I don't know who's over there. 2 people have been gunned down, and, you know, is it safe? You know, so safety's one concern, and the other is that part of what went on here? And so, where's the crime scene start and stop?
And when you got to the house, did it appear that the house had been searched and cleared in any form or fashion?
I didn't see any signs of that, but I'm not a criminologist, I'm not a prosecutor, I'm not a defense lawyer, but I mean, it looked like just a regular house.
Okay. But before you go to the house, did you have any conversations with law enforcement about, you know, your knowledge of Paul receiving threats?
Yeah, I had asked, when I was standing where I had driven up, Buddy Hill had come over there, and he asked me if I knew, because I know Sheriff Hill, and he asked if I had any idea of who might want to do this, and I said, not really. And he said, do you know of any threats? And I said, you know, I know Paul had gotten, since the boat wreck, that he had gotten several, you know, threats and just people cranking off from all over the place, not necessarily local, but from everywhere. And I would hear it from, you know, Alec from time to time, and different stuff. And so I told him that.
Did when you had that conversation with Sheriff Hill, had you spoken to Alec?
I had not at that point. I hadn't gotten over to him.
When you had that conversation with Sheriff Hill, had you listened to the 911 call?
No, sir.
That thought of threats, was that an independent thought of yours?
Well, it was response to a question,
right,
from Sheriff Hill.
And your thought process was about the boating accident.
Well, that was the only threat that I knew of that Paul had ever encountered.
When, do you remember who went to the house when you went into the Moselle residence?
Yeah.
Who was with you?
Well, I mean, I probably can't name them all. I'll probably leave somebody off, but it was myself, Ronnie Crosby, Lee Cooke, Austin Crosby, Neil, Alger, Randy Murdaugh, Alec.
Had Buster gotten there yet?
Buster had gotten there, I believe, but I'm not sure. He and Brooklyn, I remember when they came up, but I can't tell you whether it was over before we left over there. It seems to me that they drove up at the house, but I can't tell you for certain. And then there was Corey Fleming and Chris Wilson showed up, Lynn, John Marvin, just a host of people. Greg Alexander, chief of police in Yemassee, who's a friend of theirs, showed up. There were
A lot of people in the house.
a lot of people.
What did you observe the condition of the house?
When we came in the door, we obviously went to the den, and we're standing around. The den and the kitchen in that house are connected, and there were pots on the stove, so Lee Cope and myself and I think Austin got the pots. I think I set something in the sink, and they stuck some in the refrigerator.
But when you entered the house, it looked like there was food out that had been prepared for dinner?
There was food on the stove, yeah.
Okay.
I don't recall seeing any plates, but somebody else could have picked them up. I wouldn't.
But were folks cleaning up?
Sure.
And what time of day was this?
It was probably 1:30 or 2 in the morning.
Do you remember what time you left the Moselle residence on that night, early morning?
I probably left at 3:30 or 4. I left when Alec was leaving.
When did you go back to the property?
I had a deposition the next morning, and I ended up having to take it, and then I got out there about 11, I guess.
And was Alec there when you got there?
I went over to the dog pen over that way. I had gotten a call that morning about 8 o'clock from Randy, 8 or 8:15, and John had gone over there trying to clean up and just couldn't do it. I mean, emotionally, and Randy had asked me if I could see about finding somebody to come clean it up, or did I know anybody, and I called the coroner's office to find out if they had people that did that type of work or knew of people that did that type of work, and ultimately the coroner called me back and gave me the names of 2 companies, and
Okay.
I gave those to Lee, and he started trying to run them down.
Okay. I inadvertently skipped over something on my outline. When you were at the house before you left, so you left about 3:30 in the morning or so, were you there when SLED agents came up and took custody of Alex's clothes that he was wearing?
I was. They knocked on the door. Somebody answered the door. For some reason, I got up and walked over there, and they said they needed his clothes and to, I think, swab his hands. I walked back over. Alec had been sitting next to me on the couch. There's 2 couches in the den that sort of face each other, and then 2 chairs that are headed towards the kitchen. He was sitting on the far couch, and I walked back over and I said, Alec, they need your clothes. Can you step back here with these folks? And it was a male and a female.
Okay. Well, before we go any further, let me ask you, were your clothes wet or dry when you were sitting on the couch?
They were pretty wet. They weren't soaked, but they were uncomfortably damp.
And do you recall whether Alex's clothes were damp as well?
I would assume they are. I didn't reach over
And did you see how the clothes were, I guess, collected? Were they put on a hanger, wrapped up carefully, or what happened?
The male went into what Alex's bedroom, at least I'm assuming that's Alex's bedroom, And he came back out, and then I saw Alec just kind of, the female agent or officer was holding the bag, and Alec dropped him in.
There was one bag, multiple bags?
I thought it was one, but I couldn't tell you whether it was one or two or three.
All right. Went down, now I'm jumping back to where we were on the morning of June the 8th. After you got out of your deposition, did you go to the property?
I did.
And you went down to the kennels?
I did. I drove over there.
Had the crime scene been released?
It had been released, and because I asked Randy that morning, he said, yeah, they've released it when John was down there.
And what'd you do?
I just wandered around. There was a sled agent there. I think at some point Duffy Stone and Sean, his deputy, Thornton, was there, and I think one of their investigators, they were over inside the hangar, and there was a sled agent. At least I'm presuming he was a sled agent, and I don't know who he was. It wasn't any of the ones that were working the case that I came to find out that were working the case later on that I can remember. And I looked around at different things.
Did you look in the feed room?
I did.
What did you see in the feed room?
Well, by that time, I think Ronnie had either come up or was over there.
Ronnie
Crosby.
Your law partner.
And I think Lee Cooke was there as well, but I'm not sure about that. I'm pretty sure. And I was looking in the feed room, and you could see, you know, obviously there was still a pretty raw scene. And there were
there still remains of Paul in the feed room that had not been collected?
At first I didn't see it. I saw shot, you know, on the floor, steel shot on the floor, number 2. Steel
shot, you mean pellets from a...
Yeah, like bird shot, except it was number 2, steel.
Okay, and you saw that in the feed room?
It was all over everything. It was on the floor, it was on the shelves, it was various places.
Okay.
And then I got to looking around, and there was you could see where a piece of buckshot had gone through, and you could see where it knocked out, you know, or shot through twice where the window was, or is. 2 had gone through that. There was some plastic crates or something, and you could see where one of the shot had gone through and had embedded in the window frame right there, the molding. And then there was a piece of buckshot laying on the ledge of the windowsill.
What did you do when you observed the shots?
I walked back out and asked what I thought was the agent. And
what was the agent?
He said, "We've got all we need." And so I walked back over there and looked around, and then looking around around the floor and all that, there was a piece of Paul's skull about the size of a baseball laying there.
Did that upset you?
It did, very much. I mean, it just really infuriated me. And I don't know who I was supposed to be mad at, but it just infuriated me that this young man had been murdered, and there was still his remains there. And there was a large blood spot and tissue out right off of the apron of that area right outside the feed room that was there. And it's kind of like walking across a grave. It's one of those things you just don't do.
Right. After you spent time down at the kennel area, what'd you do next?
I ended up going back to the house, and I remember Terry Brandstetter, Aggie's daddy, was there, and several other people, and I spoke to them and went in the house, and eventually went towards where the gun room was that afternoon.
Did sled agents come up to search the house while you were present?
They did. They
And I think the jury's seen a video of it. We don't need to play it, but were you present in the gun room?
I was. I think they probably 2:30 or 3 o'clock, something like that. They showed up, and I had a discussion with that same agent and I'm assuming it's a sled agent. It could have been a sheriff's deputy, but I made the assumption that it was a sled agent over at the kennels and the hangar. I asked if they'd figured out what kind of gun it was, and at that time didn't know, I assumed it was a 223 based on the night before. Barry McRoy had said that he thought it was some type of assault rifle, and I just immediately kind of went there, and that agent had said that it was a three something, and I said a 300 blackout, and he said yeah, and I said, well, there's one over there in the gun rack, and he said no, there's not, and apparently Sled had been there sometime that morning or whatever. He said they already checked, there's not one over there, and I said yes there is, and so later on when they got there, there was one there.
So, and you located it for Sled?
Yeah.
The night, early morning hours, 2 or 3 o'clock before you left, had you seen the gun room?
I had.
Were there guns on the pool table and whatnot?
I walked in there. The door was shut. I think the door was shut between it and the sort of a transition hall. You go through there, and then there was a bathroom, and then where the freezers were, and then it exits out onto the porch. And then straight ahead would be, I guess in the original house plans, would have been a garage, but it was kind of a den game room that Alec had turned into a recreation/gun room, and a large room. And I walked in there, and there were 3 shotguns on the table, pool table,
Right.
and some other stuff, some shells and stuff.
And when you went back the next day, the 8th, in daylight hours, early afternoon, it looked like things had been put up.
They had been put up. There were no guns on the table. There were no shells, no nothing there. And so I asked what happened to that. And I was told that the maid had put them up. And so I went and asked her.
Was it Blanca?
And yeah, I went to Blanca, and she said, yeah, I was told to clean up the room. And so I put them up and put them in the rack.
And did you point out to the Sled agents the guns that were on the table that you thought you'd seen the night before?
I didn't point out the guns. I told them that there had been guns there.
When you're on the property on the, I guess the morning on the 8th at some point in time, did you observe an employee that had been working on the property for Alec, individual by the name of C.B. Rowe?
I did.
And did you take pictures of his vehicle for some reason?
I took pictures of a vehicle. I didn't know whose vehicle it was. There was a vehicle that had pulled up underneath of the, again, if you were standing in front of the hangar where the big door is, it would have been to the right. And there was a truck that had pulled up in there, and it didn't have a license tag on it. And when I walked by it, there was a jug of Clorox, and I can't remember what else was in there, but it was a jug of Clorox, and I just thought that was odd.
Where was the Clorox?
It was in the bed of the truck.
Okay.
And I took a couple of pictures of it and turned them over to Sled.
And why did you take pictures?
It just looked odd. You know, 2 people had gotten killed, and, you know, there's Clorox around.
Okay. There's been I won't make a statement. Did you see any coolers on the property down there?
I did.
Where did you see a cooler?
When I walked around the bottom part between the skin and shed and the hangar and the other shed, there was a open cooler there, or looked like a Yeti style cooler, and I can't tell you whether it was a Yeti or not, but it was one of those thicker coolers, and there was probably a dozen beer cans around it that night, and the next day when I walked by it was still there.
Okay.
I just thought it, with all the people and the hoopla that had gone on, that it didn't look very good.
Okay. Did you, I mean, was that the only thing that stood out about the cooler, the beer cans around?
The beer cans, yeah. Looked like somebody had unloaded a boat or something,
Right.
and just kind of thrown them out of the boat and forgot about them and left it.
Did, what kind of law do you practice?
Civil,
Okay. Plaintiffs, defense?
mostly plaintiffs. Occasionally I'll defend a, small business or a farmer or something like that, but
Right.
for the most part, it's all
during the-
plaintiffs.
Course of your practice, have you had experience with getting cell phone records of, parties to find out information?
I have. It's pretty regular now. I mean, just about every defense lawyer asks, and every plaintiff's lawyer asks, because so many people are texting and talking on the phone when they rear end somebody or crash into somebody or whatever, and you want to know if you ask them, were you on the phone, and they say no, and it shows up on the bill, then they probably were on the phone.
And as, part of your, I guess, concern about Maggie and Paul and Alec, did you pull his cell phone records?
Well, I was asked to pull them, and yeah, we provided them to both SLED and for Alex cell phone records, or Alex cell phone records.
And if you're trying to get information from an opposing party or something about cell phone records, are the records more reliable than the actual handheld phone device?
Objection, Your Honor.
In your experience?
401, 402.
Did you hear the objection?
I
As a lawyer, then you don't respond until the court rules. Response to the objection.
There's been testimony about deleted call logs, Your Honor, and this addresses that issue.
Anything further? Objection's overruled.
I don't know that aspect of it. That's a technical. I get the records because they're more accessible than getting a download and going through the. There are cases that you may want to get a download, but the run-of-the-mill cases, with truck wrecks and stuff, the records of the cell phone call records tend to answer the question that I'm asking.
You've known Alec for 30 plus years?
Yes, sir.
You recognize his voice?
Yes, sir.
And I think at one point in time were you asked to identify his voice on a video of down at the kennel?
Yes, sir.
And did you do so?
Yes, sir.
And you determined it was Alec's voice?
Alec, Maggie, and Paul.
And you told that to SLED?
Yes, sir.
Have you listened to a tape that's been played in this courtroom about whether Alex said, I did them so bad or they did them so bad?
Objection. 401, 402, and beyond the scope of this witness's knowledge.
Objection overruled.
I was sent a snippet and asked the question
Okay.
what it was, and
But hang on, I'm not getting your response. So let's, Your Honor, we'd like to play the snippet from State's Exhibit 153 for this witness.
You're a witness.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And Your Honor, I would object. I believe that this witness was not present for this conversation, and again, would object under 401 and 402 in relevance to his commentary on that particular exhibit.
Objection's overruled.
And sitting there talking today is tough.
It's just so bad. It's so bad.
sounds like they to me.
Right.
I played the snippet multiple times, and
And is it consistent with what he told you the night of the murders?
it is.
You remember in, I think February 2019, that Paul Murdaugh was involved in a boating accident.
I do.
And you're aware that he was criminally charged?
I am.
And then Alec, and I believe Buster were civilly sued.
Yes, sir.
And did you work on the case formally?
Not formally, no. I was about to get in after the murders, along with several other partners.
Did leading up to the murders, did you have conversations with Alec about civil case and the criminal case?
I did about the civil case to begin with, and then when the charges came out, I talked with Deanne Randolph.
What was Alex, if you know, what he expressed to you his priority between the two matters was?
Well, obviously the criminal matter was much more pressing for him.
And in your conversations with him, did you gain an understanding of his concern about the civil case?
Yeah, somewhat. But
how concerning was the civil case?
Well, I mean, obviously, anytime you get sued, you've got to be concerned about it. And, you know, it was the whole boating accident as a whole was very negative towards him, towards Paul, and the entire family, or his entire family. And so, you know, it was obviously it wasn't a nothing, but at the same time, I read the complaint. Several partners and my lawyers in my firm read the complaint, and at the time that he was sued, the causes of action against Alec were drafted probably to try to get as much insurance coverage as they could, which is what you do as a plaintiff's lawyer. You're looking for coverage. You don't want to make allegations that get you out of coverage, and it was very vanilla against him. And the allegations against Alec were that I sort of referred to him, and others did as well, as sort of bad parenting. You had an adult child that the allegation was that you allowed him to go out and drink, and when you're 18, you pretty much get to do what you want, and you've reached your majority. And so I thought it was very defensible as to those causes of action at that time, or that cause of action.
Sure.
And I think he did too, but I don't know what he thought.
Right. Did it, some point in time, Alec, was he forced to resign from the firm?
He was. September the 3rd.
What day was it?
September the 3rd.
And after that, did you have an opportunity to look in his office?
I did. He resigned on the 3rd. Then there was the incident on the 4th. And I left the scene over there on Old Salkehatchie and went by the office. And I'd also been in his office on Friday after he resigned.
When you were in his office, did you find any paperwork that looked like he had been working on for the boating case?
Not until the 5th.
Okay, and what paperwork did you find on the 5th?
The 5th, I went in and started really, because we have an obligation to those clients that he was representing, and I didn't want files just laying around. This was Labor Day weekend. All this hoopla and emotion of, you know, the murders, the issues with Alec leaving the firm, and then that Saturday. And so that Sunday I went in to the office and went to his office and started going through to make sure that any client files were put over in stack, you know, over there. And as I was going through, I found checks that he had deposited with his telephone that were some of the funds that sort of started all this mess with the Ferris case. They were laying, one was on his top of his desk, one was in a drawer. I pulled out one of the drawers, and there was a tablet, a legal tablet, that had numbers written down on it as far as debts and assets and, just kind of the scribblings of kind of what you owe and what you've got.
Would it be something that you would normally see on a net worth statement?
It would be the same information. When I think of a net worth statement, I think of the form that a bank sends you.
Right.
But yeah, it obviously, he was listing what he had and what he owed.
Is it something, the type of format you've seen in civil litigation where a defendant's required to produce net worth?
Not in the same form, but the same information.
I skipped another topic. After Maggie and Paul's death, did you collect her jewelry?
I did. I got a call on the Wednesday, I believe, after the murders on Monday from the coroner. His wife and my wife had worked as surgical nurses at Hampton Hospital together, and then my wife ended up being the supervisor over that area, and so I knew them very well, and I'd known Rich for 30 years. He called and said that Lori had cleaned up the jewelry, and whenever Alec wanted it, and I said, well, I'll come get it. And so I met him, Ronnie Crosby, and I came over to his office and picked it up, signed for it, and I carried it back to the house.
And within the jewelry, do you remember the wedding ring and wedding bands and other jewelry?
There were rings, I can't tell you. There was the thing that sticks out to me was she had a diamond bracelet on, and it was in pieces. Right. And he said he tried to find all the pieces, but there was still some missing. Okay. But I wasn't paying attention so much to, it just didn't feel right looking and snooping around in somebody else's stuff.
Knowing Alec for 30 years, do you develop an assessment of his relationship with his family, Maggie, Paul, and Buster?
Well, I will tell you this. The person I thought I knew loved his family, or appeared to love his family very much. He'd take their calls, he'd do all of those things. After, September the 3rd, I'm not sure I know that person. And so, but he always seemed to be devoted to everything. Their ball games, he would aggravate the hell out of me when you'd be in a deposition and they would call and he'd answer it, and you'd be in a meeting or whatever, and he always took their calls. Whereas my wife and my children never called me unless it was a true emergency, and Alec took their calls whether it was they needed a gallon of milk, or they had something important to tell him. I mean, he always took their calls.
And did you see them together frequently?
I did. They went places. You'd see pictures of them. I think Maggie was a pretty prolific Facebook, text, whatever. I'm not on any social media, but my daughter or my wife would show me pictures of where they had been, or ball games, different things like that. I never saw anything that indicated to me that there was anything out of the way with any of the relationships, including the drug stuff. I had no.
Yeah, let me ask you, were you aware that he had an opioid addiction?
None.
And were any of the partners aware that he had opioid?
None to my knowledge. I mean, that was not a subject matter that ever came up. I mean, it was, and Paul, I think, has been sort of demonized by this whole affair, and it's just not fair. I mean, Paul, it's like a lot of young people I know, they kind of are trying to find where the fence is. Sometimes they get, going a little fast and, blow through some things, but Paul was a good kid. He was always polite to me. I never had one single solitary issue with him at all. And I knew he had done some things, that most kids, are mischievous do. And on at least one occasion, I went to Alec and told him that I thought Paul needed to be throttled back a little bit. That I saw some videos of him driving fast, and I don't know what Alec did, but that was, our firm was very much of a family. I mean, if you were a member of our firm, and it didn't matter whether you were a lawyer or one of our folks. I mean, our staff is family as well, and if they have a problem, we all have a problem. And so we look out for each other, and we did. Unfortunately, Alec betrayed that when he stole the money. Sure. But you know, the outward things that I saw of Alec with his kids and his wife were just that. I mean, they were what I observed. Nobody knows what goes on behind closed doors, but they seemed to enjoy each other's company.
All right. Daggy, Corson, I have no further questions.
Mr. Waters?
Please support.
Mr. Waters, could I steal one of your waters there?
Absolutely.
There you go.
He was pretty good at hiding who he really was, wasn't he?
Obviously.
You known him for 34 years?
I knew him for 34 years, or I have known him for 34 years.
Thought y'all were pretty good friends?
Thought so.
Interacted many times a week?
We had his son Buster and my daughter were in school all the way from kindergarten on, and I would see him at work early on. He didn't work for us immediately when he came out of law school. He worked for Jim Moss and Coon, and then he came to us about 5 or 6 years after that.
But you've shared a business with him for how long?
Probably 20 some odd years.
He was your partner?
He was a partner.
You trusted him?
You have to, and I did.
And outwardly, to your appearance, he was a good lawyer, he was a partner to you, he was someone you could trust and rely on, wasn't he?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
Outwardly, from what you observed.
Yes, sir.
He was a good partner, he was a good lawyer, he was someone in part of your business, somebody that you could trust and rely on. Is that true?
Yes, he was.
And outwardly, you thought that he had a good relationship with his family? Is that correct?
That is correct.
But you have just testified that you didn't really know this man, did you?
Obviously, I did not. I mean, had we known the things he was doing, we wouldn't have been law partners.
You were asked about the kennel video.
Yes, sir.
And you've had a chance to review that kennel video.
A couple of times.
And you and I have talked quite a few times, is that correct?
We have. I didn't see the kennel video until probably a month or two ago.
But you've reviewed it here recently, is that correct?
I have several times.
All right. And any doubt in your mind that Alex Murdaugh, Maggie, and Paul were on that kennel video at 8:44 p.m. on June 7th, 2021?
None.
No doubt in your mind?
No doubt.
Do I need to play it for you again, or no doubt in your mind?
I played it all I want to hear.
Well, let's talk about that just a little bit. And we'll talk more in some detail, but I want to go ahead and cover this. You saw Alec the night of the murders.
I did.
And you knew Maggie very well, you knew Paul very well.
I did.
And you went to the scene where Alec was, is that right?
I did.
And did you even ride with Alec or take Alec back over to the house?
I'm pretty sure he rode back over to the house. I think he and Randy, because their vehicles were impounded over there.
And did you eventually, as things started to move forward, sit down on the couch with him back at the house?
I did.
Fix yourself a liquor drink?
Probably a heavy one.
I get it. And did you talk to Alec about what he did that night?
I don't know whether it was, I know on the couch we talked, but I talked to him several times, including before the masses got there, as to trying to figure out, do you know anything? Do you have any idea who did this?
Because you were very concerned. You want to get to the bottom of this, right?
Well, for a lot of reasons.
For a lot of reasons. For the family, for what happened to Maggie and Paul, for the law firm, for all the people involved.
All of it. I mean, it's safety of, if it was something to do with him and the law practice, we didn't want somebody to show back up at the front door and harm our folks. We didn't want them to harm any of the other lawyers' families. If it was some person that was deranged, we just didn't know. I mean, this isn't an ordinary occurrence in your practice of law.
You thought you were his buddy, been partners for 34 years, y'all are sitting on the couch, is that right?
Like family.
And you start talking to him, is he responding to your questions appropriately?
He was.
Answering the correct subject matter?
He was. He was very upset, obviously.
Sure,
I mean,
but he was answering your questions, he wasn't unable to make sentences and
he
that
was.
sort of.
Yeah.
And did you talk to him about what he did that night?
Yeah.
And did he deny ever going down to those kennels to his buddy and law partner of 34 years?
He said that he ate dinner, laid down on the couch, took a nap, and then left to check on him.
And now you know that's not true from seeing the kennel video, right?
Dude,
And that wasn't the only time he told you that, is it?
no, at least 3 times.
At least 3 times. And this would be over the subsequent days,
Yes, sir.
subsequent conversations that you had with him?
Yes, sir.
And he was always clear that he never went down to those kennels after they ate dinner?
It was the same version of it, but it wasn't always just me.
Okay, and we'll talk about that. Who else was present at some of those conversations?
Well, I mean, there were other law partners, and I can't tell you exactly who all was there, but, I mean, I know on that Thursday following this, I heard him say it then.
Okay, and there were other law partners there?
Yes.
Were their family there?
I don't know whether they were in the room at the time or not. I just know there were law partners there.
Was Jim Griffin there?
I can't speak as to what, he was present on the property, but I don't know whether he was there.
And did Alec tell the same version of events, that he never went down to those kennels?
Yeah, he did, but I don't know whether Mr. Griffin was there. We were there before Mr. Griffin was there.
In his conversations with you, did he ever change his story about who he checked first at the scene, supposedly?
I've heard it both ways, and I don't know whether it's just I don't know whether it's just because of the trauma of the situation, but one time it was, the first time I remember, he checked Maggie first and then went to Paul, and then I heard him say at one point that it was Paul and then it was Maggie. It didn't really matter to me. It wasn't something I really was picking up on because it was horrendous either way. I mean, I can't imagine seeing my wife dead and my son dead in such a brutal manner. So I never put any real stock in that. But it did, it oscillated.
It did oscillate from what he was saying.
From the first time I heard it, but
The story changed.
well, yeah, as to which
Okay.
was which.
Over the days following this event, this law firm, as you said, was like a family, right?
Was.
You thought you were very close to this man, just like you feel close to your other law partners and their families and the staff and everybody else.
It wasn't just the lawyers that felt that way. It was, I mean,
The
the funeral, the
paralegals.
paralegals were there.
Yeah.
The law firm shut down. They were also we had to go on a heightened alert. I contacted SLED about what we should be doing because there was a statement that came out about they didn't know of any danger to the public, and we're left with trying to make sure that the 60 or 75 people that work with us are all safe and they go home to their families. And SLED responded. I called the lieutenant over here, and he called me back that evening, and was very helpful as far as trying to tell us. He said, I don't know of any specific threats, but here's some precautions, and I think what y'all are doing is the right thing, and they were helpful. And but there was still that undertow of, you know, who did this, and are they going to, and it just, people were just on edge all the time.
And you're not a criminal lawyer or prosecutor, I think you said.
I'm not.
But still a lawyer, and so you and your partners, including his brother Randy, were very focused on trying to figure out what happened here, what is wrong here, correct? What happened on June 7th, 2021,
Sure.
right? Very focused on that, were you not?
We were. I mean, it was taking a lot of time off.
But he was not, was he? You've
know,
said
Mr.
that before, have you not?
I have said that, but I don't know, Mr. Waters, how I would respond if I'd lost, and I've told you the same thing. I don't know how you're supposed to react when you lose your wife and your child in such a brutal manner. But no, to answer your question, I didn't see him on the phone like I was trying to call clients and did you hear anything? Did you see anything? Those kinds of things. So, I mean, the answer is no, I didn't see him doing that. I wasn't around him all the time, but no, I did not.
And you've already testified that you and other law partners and family and staff were very concerned about potential threats because of what happened on June 7th. Is that right?
Very concerned.
And you thought it odd, though, that he was not concerned about any threats even to Buster, correct?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. The night that this happened, I asked Alec where Buster was, and he said, we've gotten a hold of him, Brooklyn's bringing him. And I said, are you sure he's all right? And he said, yeah, he's riding with Brooklyn. And I said, you think he needs any protection or something along those lines? I don't know that it was exactly those words. And he said, they'll be here in a little while, he'll be fine. But he was so addled, I didn't hang anything on anything Alec was saying.
But after that, in the days that followed, you continued to interact with him. He never asked for any protection or expressed any concern about protection for Buster, did he? And
Not to me, he did not.
Not to you.
And, you know, the only thing I can tell you is that 4th of July, he came to Ronnie Crosby's house, and he had a pistol in his bag, which was, to me, was unusual. And of course, in classic Alec, Buster, and Paul style, he ended up leaving the bag there when they left.
This law firm's been in existence how long?
1910
1910.
was.
And-
We're no longer.
I'm sorry?
We're no longer. We're now
It
the Parker
was.
Law Group
It was until he came along, right? Until all this happened, right?
until September of 2021.
September of 2021. And was a relative of Alex, his great-grandfather was part of that initial law firm, is that right?
His great-grandfather was the beginning of that law firm.
And was he also the solicitor for the 14th Circuit for this area of the state?
He was from, I believe, 1920 until 1940 when he was killed in a train accident.
And then did the defendant's grandfather become solicitor?
Buster
The
started.
chief prosecutor for this area?
Buster took over in 1940 and was the solicitor until 1946. And then Randolph was appointed by the governor and then was until he was 72.
And his father became solicitor, is what you just said, is that right?
Randolph.
Until about when?
Randolph was 82 when he passed away, so 10 years ago maybe, around there. And Buster left the solicitor's office in 86 when he became 72. At the end of 86, beginning of 87, I think Randolph took over, and Buster became the assistant solicitor
All right. And how long was Randolph solicitor?
until about 10 years ago. And was still an assistant when he passed, I believe.
Do I?
I believe he was still an assistant solicitor.
Mr. Randolph was?
He was.
And so was the defendant, too, wasn't he?
He was in some form or fashion.
He had a badge. Did you
Yeah.
ever see a badge that he had?
I did.
Where did he keep that badge that you saw?
Usually it was on the corner of his dashboard.
driving around with it in front of his dashboard?
A lot of times, yeah.
This family is very, very powerful, were they not? Very influential in this community?
I mean, they had a very good name. They had, you know, they were known to help you with your problems.
How important was that family legacy to the defendant?
Very, or seemed to be very important.
I think you've said that it was more important to him than anybody else that you observed.
It seemed that way. I mean, whenever there would be discussions of name changes or anything, he would be very involved in that, much more involved in that than he would be in other business matters.
And he even talked to you about wanting, that being the defendant, wanting to be solicitor as well.
At one time, yeah.
You talked a little bit about the scene. And there were, when you arrived, there were other law partners there as well. Is that right?
Not when I arrived. Randy was there.
Randy was there. Other law partners showed up.
They showed up over the next hour and a half or so.
Okay.
From Jasper County, from Beaufort, from all over.
And there were a lot of powerful attorneys at that scene as it was being processed, including the defendant. Is that right?
Well, obviously, Alec was there, and the rest of us, and then I don't know of any other lawyers at the scene other than us being our firm members.
And was law enforcement always polite and respectful during this entire process?
Absolutely.
And when they came to the house that day, the video where the Jeff Croft came in and searched for those guns, were they polite and respectful?
They were very polite.
Did they have a long conversation because they knew family was in the house about trying to do this as delicately as they can without upsetting everybody and doing some big search and running everybody out of the house and all that stuff?
Katie, and I apologize, I can't remember her last name. She offered to take off all of her identification, her gun, and all of that, and we told her that wasn't necessary.
Mr. Chair, move.
Okay, I can.
Speak a little louder.
Okay, sure. That's usually
Scoot
not a
up a little
problem.
bit, it might help, so you don't have to lean forward.
Yeah, I mean, Katie offered to really, you know, be very behind the scenes, so to speak, and everybody, I've not had, you know, the vast majority of them have been extremely polite and very, very responsive to anything that we ask.
Because of all the family there and the tragedy that happened, they were very delicate and respectful of that when they came to the house that day. Is that correct?
In looking back, they probably were too much.
But they were.
They were very.
You said that Alec would always ride in his Suburban with that badge up in the front dashboard, to your observation, right?
I don't know that he always did, but a
lot of the time.
time.
He also generally carried a pistol in the car too, didn't he?
I didn't know that. I can't
But
testify.
you've heard that now, haven't you?
I've heard that, but I didn't know that.
What was Alec like with his cell phone? He was on it all the time, wasn't he?
He was on the cell phone all the time.
He would constantly be using it, constantly responding to calls in the middle of conversations, always had it with him, to your observation, being his law partner for 30 some odd years. Is that correct?
He was an obnoxious user of the cell phone.
And would it have been unusual for him to go down to those kennels without his cell phone with him?
I mean,
You've said that, haven't you?
I don't know whether I've said it or not said it, but I would think it would be unusual for Alec to go anywhere without his phone.
was he like as a lawyer? Was he a very academic or type lawyer, or were his skills elsewhere?
Well, I mean, Alex was a very good lawyer. I mean, he got good results for his clients. He got, he could look at a set of facts and really do well with them, figuring out where to go with the issues, where to push and where to not push and pull. And he was very good tactically. I wouldn't say that I'm a great academic lawyer. I think I'm pretty good at figuring out where the seams are to figure out the solution. And I think Alex was much more like I am in that respect as far as looking at facts and talking with people. Alex never met anybody that he couldn't talk to. He could talk to a fence post.
Talk to a fence post. I think you've said that people were his trade.
They were.
And he understood the emotion of the cases very well, did he not?
He did.
And he could be very convincing with people, as you've come to find out from all that you've uncovered. Is that correct?
Absolutely. He convinced us since 2006.
Effortlessly and easily lied to you for years, and you didn't know it.
Didn't know it.
Correct?
Didn't know it and didn't catch it. In fact, it just the way he was doing it was very, very cunning.
Cunning. Remind the jury who Jeannie's second juror is. It's been a long trial, but remind them who she is.
She is our in-house accountant, CFO. She's the money person, but she goes beyond that. She did management stuff. She would be the person that at one time she was kind of managing the non-lawyer staff, but she could still rein in the lawyers as well.
And in the wake of all this financial stuff that came up on September 4th, she was one of the ones tasked with going through and figuring out the extent of what he had done. Is that correct?
She and I worked a lot.
And you worked on that as well. Is that correct?
Correct. One of the things that has come up, and there was this issue that happened back in 2017 where we had, at the beginning of the year, the law firm depletes all the money, and then you have to start off the year. Well, money's coming in, and you may not have enough to cover your bills in January and February. So we do a loan, and generally the partners, ones that wanted to participate, would put money in, and then they'd get paid back as soon as we got on a cash positive in the new year. And there was an issue in 2017 where Alex was paid. He didn't put the money in, but the check was written to him by mistake. And I've gone back and looked at it and made sure, but his name and Randy's name appeared at one over the other, and it was just a fat finger or just a missed thing with the mouse. And the check was generated to Alex. And then there was a second check generated, one in March, one in April. The one check was negotiated in May, I think. The other check stayed on his desk and was negotiated the next October. Well, what that did was that threw out and this is in our operating account. It wasn't client money. So it threw our operating account out of balance. And when we started looking at it, then we realized that he wasn't the one that was supposed to have gotten paid. We had basically a powwow. Our president, Danny Henderson, went to him, talked to him about it, and Alex swore that it was just a mistake, and he paid back the money with interest because Randy had been out of his money.
Paid it back with stolen money, correct?
Well, I didn't know that, but I mean, he paid it back, and I think there had been testimony that somehow that got swept under the rug. It did not get swept under the rug at all. It was investigated, but everything seemed to make sense because the check was written to him. He cashed a check that was written to him, and well, I might know whether or not I had an extra $123,000 or whatever it was, or 21. Alex always seemed just sort of disheveled with his own funds, so it made enough sense, and there wasn't enough there to get in a brouhaha and you know, terminate somebody or create more of a fuss than it was, but it wasn't swept under the rug. Everything seemed to fall into place at the time. Now, obviously, had we known any of the other stuff at the time that we found out in September, then it would have been a different story.
But bottom line is, it got discovered. Oops, it was a big mistake, he says. He pays it back, and people move on, right?
And that was in 2018.
That was in 2018. And we're talking about the check written that was supposed to go to his brother that went to him instead.
Right.
And he was never one to loan money for those operating expenses generally, is that right?
I think he had loaned once or twice, but
Once or
not,
twice.
it wasn't regular.
Right, and not around this time period, correct?
I didn't go back and look at that part of it.
It was $125,000 roughly, something like that?
121, 125.
All right.
I was more concerned about how it happened to begin with. Randy's initials are RM, and Alex's initials in our system are RAM. So that was.
And what he did was he gets that check, and instead of saying, this isn't $120,000 for me, he actually goes to staff a couple days later and says, I lost that check, cut me another one, right?
Yes, sir.
And then he cashes that one, right?
He eventually cashes.
He cashes the
First
second
one.
one
Yeah,
in pretty short order, correct?
He cashes the first one in October the next year.
And
He
then
cashes-
sits on the other one for an extended period of time and then cashes that one, right?
He did.
Steals the same money twice, right?
Yes, sir.
What was the word you used before, cunning?
Very cunning.
And you mentioned that it wasn't swept under the rug, but he said, oh, it was a big mistake, and he pays the money back, and then people move on, even though because, okay, it's just Alec, that sort of thing, correct?
Correct.
But there are other instances like that, too, over the years. For example, using private planes for personal use and billing that to the firm, is that right?
Well,
Or explain that.
some of that, but the biggest thing was the credit cards using. He just wasn't a very good rule follower at all. But he
With
did-
other people's money, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, anytime you're in a law firm or you're working for somebody and you've got a card or a check that's got their name on it, then you owe them a responsibility to spend it properly. And
It's other people's money, right?
it's other people's money.
And he would spend personal use on the credit cards, and y'all have to talk to him about that, right?
Yes, sir.
And that was going on repeatedly, correct?
Up until the end.
Put tuition on a firm credit card for one of his children, correct?
He did.
I had to talk to him about that, right?
Yes, sir.
And he'd pay it back, and then people would move on, right? And that had been going on for years, had it not?
It had, but there were other people that would
But not like him, right?
not to that
Not
degree.
like him.
Not to that degree.
Now, you talked a little bit about the boat case, but back in May of 2021, Jeannie came to you and told you about what Annette had discovered about them receiving the expense check in the Ferris case, but not the fee check, right?
Sometime in that time frame, yes.
And your initial concern was, and you were concerned that he was going to try to hide assets because of the boat case. That was part of your concern, and the firm was not going to participate in that if that was what was going on.
That's correct, that he was either going to structure them or leave them in somebody else's trust account until it had passed. I mean, we weren't going to fudge our books for that benefit.
And you were aware that in the boat case, they were seeking a personal recovery against Alec, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that caused you concern because this firm was not going to participate in helping him hide assets because of this boat case, correct? That was your concern.
He or anybody else.
Or anybody else. And you had continued conversations with Jeannie over the next few weeks about this because she couldn't get a straight answer as to what he had done with those fees, correct?
Myself and Jeannie and at least two other partners.
Lee Cope?
Lee Cope and
Another partner?
Ronnie Crosby.
And Ronnie Crosby. And couldn't get a straight answer, could you?
Well, we weren't getting a straight answer,
Weren't getting
so
a straight
we continued, but we didn't want to make it a big deal if it wasn't a big deal, but because we didn't have the information, we couldn't make a decision.
And then on June 7th, 2021, Jeannie went in there to demand that straight answer, correct?
Yes, sir, I didn't know that until June the 8th.
But you knew it was coming to a head, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, Jeannie's tenacious. I mean, she's going to get to the answer. She's not going to let go until, and it wouldn't just be this, it would be anything.
But unlike the other times, Alec didn't have the money to pay it back and make it all go away, did he, this time?
I didn't know that.
But you know that now, don't you?
Well, yeah, obviously, the whole world does.
Maggie was your friend?
Who?
Maggie was your friend?
She was all of our friends, yes.
Paul was your friend?
Sure. He was dear friends with particularly my youngest daughter.
He was a good kid?
He was a good kid. I mean, he had his issues like everybody else. I mean, I don't know anybody that's raised children. If they say they're perfect, then they need to write a book. But, I mean,
I don't think any of us want to be judged by what we did when we were 18 or 19, do we?
I don't want to be judged with what I did, or I really don't want to be judged with how I raised my children. But, those are individual decisions. But, Paul was a good kid. He was always polite. I could have picked up the phone and called Paul and said, "Hey, I need some help over here on my farm." That kid would have come in a heartbeat. He was just a good kid. Now, did he do some devilish things? Absolutely. I hear about them, and occasionally, if I saw him, I'd say something to him about it. But he was a good kid. I mean, great outdoorsman. He grew a garden. I mean, Randolph, who they called handsome, I mean, he'd do anything in the world. And after the boat wreck, the two of them were almost glued together. And I mean, it's just a total waste of a kid that had never found his potential yet, but would have, I'm quite confident.
And after this tragedy happened to the family that was this law firm, everybody was focused solely on that, coming to support one another and coming to support Alex Murdaugh. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And the last thing on anyone's mind at that time was those dadgum Ferris fees when this happened. Isn't that right? And you've said that.
We actually, at least myself and one or two others, said, well, we'll have to put that on hold. I mean, it was it wasn't just we're not going to, subconsciously, but we consciously said we're going to, a man just lost his wife and child. There's no way we're going to be cruel. We'll get back to it later. And we did.
Got back to it later. A couple months later, right? Or a month later.
A month later.
You're advised that, oh, wait a minute, Chris Wilson says he has those fees all along, right?
It's what I was told.
Because in the wake of those murders, he had managed to borrow some money from Johnny Parker, right?
I found that out later.
And he had managed to have Palmetto State Bank, through Russell Lafitte, give him $350,000 in undocumented funds, correct?
I found that out later as well.
Just like
after he'd been
before,
terminated.
you get an email saying, yeah, I'm Chris Wilson, I got the fees. And that kind of put the matter to bed at that point in time, right?
That was in July, yes.
Paid it back again, or at least you think. And just like before, people move on because you're still dealing with the tragedy of this terrible set of murders, correct?
By July, we were dealing with that and still this idea of the boat wreck, and what he was going through. I mean, you rally around your family and your friends.
You rallied around him, right?
Yeah. And that's not to any way throw cold water on any of the claims of the people in the boat wreck,
Sure.
but everybody deserves a defense, and you defend your friends and your family, but you do it morally and honestly.
It's what people who think they're friends do, right?
You hope they do.
September 3rd, or thereabouts, Annette finds this Chris Wilson check in Alex's office, right?
September the 2nd, I believe.
September 2nd, right?
Yeah.
States 313.
I
I'll
can't.
show it to you.
I can't see that far.
Sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll take a recess at this time. Please go to the jury room. Please do not discuss the case. Please do not discuss your testimony. Yes, sir.
Going to the courtroom, I want them to understand there's no disrespect to the court. We have our next two witnesses. We want to make sure we were ready to go as soon as this witness comes down. So as you see me coming and going, I'm just ensuring the witness is let in the front door and put somewhere. So I apologize. There's no disrespect to the court.
How much more you have for this witness, you think?
20 minutes, Your Honor.
Then you don't know. So we don't know. Okay. It'll be 10 minutes. Folks say they can't hear you, so you need to. Yeah. You bring the jury.
Jury is present, sir.
Sir, thank you. You may proceed.
Please, court, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
All right. I think when we left off, I was showing you states, what is that, 313, I believe? And that's
313.
That's the fairest check that was found in the defendant's office that he had lied to everyone and told that he never received.
This is the first one.
One of them, at least, correct?
One of them, the first one that we knew of.
All right. And then we're around September 2nd or something like that, and around that same time, Jeannie starts printing or researching in y'all's system forge, and then finds all the fake forge checks. Is that right?
She used the query forge to see whether anything had been put into an annuity, any fees had been moved or put under an annuity, and a list came out of, I don't know, 10 or 12 different cases.
And y'all called the real forge and said, y'all have any of these clients? And they said no. Y'all ever banked to Bank of America? They said no.
We did, but in that list, like the fourth or fifth one was a client that I was representing, and the money was to be held in trust. And when we pulled up the documents, supporting documents, it had a notation on it that it was invested for 3 years, which I knew couldn't be, so I went and called the client. Client verified that he hadn't authorized anything, hadn't done anything, and I immediately told him that his funds would be put back in there, and I walked back across the street to Jeannie's office and told him we had a big problem.
And that was Thomas Moore, correct?
That was Tommy Moore, yeah.
That was a highway patrolman had been injured, correct?
Correct.
And Alex stole his money?
He did.
And they had been friends, to your knowledge?
As far as acquaintances, friends, I'm not sure what their relationship.
And I'm not going to go through in great detail because it's already been done, but generally you and Jeannie were probably the main drivers of the investigation into all of this theft in states 314, this spreadsheet.
All of us were involved, but I was with Jeannie a vast amount of the time.
I'm sorry.
I was with her a vast amount of the time, going through and auditing them and checking to see.
All right. And ultimately you had to reach out and talk to a lot of these clients of Alex Murdaugh's, right?
I did.
And you had to tell them what had happened?
I did, including 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, another one.
And you had to tell them that Alec had lied to them, right?
I did.
And they said, Alec lied to me. He never told me that, correct?
Response.
I'll move on. You had conversations with all those clients, the clients that you dealt with, right?
I dealt with the majority of them, yes.
All right. I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 314. just real quick, go through and just don't have to go into anything more, but just list the names of people that you had to deal with personally over what he had done.
Well, I was involved with the one for Barrett Bowler with Ronnie.
All right, let's talk about Barrett for a second. That was one of his close friends, right?
He was.
And can you describe the money that he stole from Barrett?
Barrett had a fire on a piece of property that he had, and it burned down the house. And there were proceeds for cleaning up, and then there were proceeds for various and sundry things that were associated, as well as the structure. And we started looking at it and figured out that the $75,000 had been stolen, and then later on that there was an additional amount that never went through there.
How much was that additional amount?
$279,000 according to this exhibit number.
That was a close friend of
314.
his, correct?
I
your understanding?
I would say that was one of his closest friends.
One of his closest friends.
That's who he ended up getting Moselle from.
And when he stole that $75,000 from Barrett Boulware, Barrett was sick and needed that money to put his wife up in a hotel near the hospital he was at, didn't he?
Barrett was dying of colon cancer, yes.
And needed that money, and Alex stole it anyway, right?
I assume he needed the money.
All right, keep going. Just, again,
The next one down is the estate of Jacob Hirschberger. And at first,
again, we don't need to get into each one, but that's one of them that you had to deal with?
that's one that I just dealt with
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, and we're still straightening it out.
But the firm had to straighten it out and deal with the money because he took it, correct?
We are now. We're in the process of it.
After talking with the clients and everybody else involved, right?
Correct.
All right, go on to the next one, please.
You want me to give the names, or?
Yeah, just give it
Mr.
a name.
Anderson I dealt with, Dion Martin, and his family I dealt with.
All right, let me slow you down. So Christopher Anderson, you said, that's somebody you had to talk to yourself?
Yes, sir.
And the firm had to pay money for what he did, correct?
Yes, sir.
Dion Martin was somebody you talked to yourself?
I did, and along with his
Been
parents.
horribly injured in an accident?
He had a brain injury, correct?
And had a brain injury?
Yes, sir.
And you had to talk to him about the defendant lying to him with his brain injury, correct?
And his parents,
And his parents and taking his money, correct?
correct.
All right, keep going.
Elise Mallory,
Elise Mallory, and she had a relative who died, correct?
she did, and I had
Very
represented.
sweet old lady. Have you met her?
Well, Elise,
That's what I mean.
she's not real.
Oh, I'm sorry. The person that you dealt with, the personal representative.
And then,
Is she a very sweet, nice lady? The PR?
yeah,
In that case?
I haven't had a single one of these clients that weren't nice people,
Very nice people.
super nice people,
And he
and,
took advantage of each one of them and lied to them, correct?
yes, sir.
All right. Tell me some more names.
The Risher case, I wasn't involved in it. Johnny Bush, I dealt with him. I talked with J.J. Jinks.
To your knowledge, Johnny Bush considered himself a friend of Alex Murdaugh's?
I don't know whether they were friends, but they were good acquaintances. Johnny was a little bit different. He had overcharged him or gave him the impression that it was the $95,000 was for expenses. It was
Right.
not.
So he lied and told him that there were expenses that had to be paid, and instead, Alex Murdaugh stole that money from his good acquaintance, Johnny Bush, correct?
That's correct.
Keep going, if you would, please.
J.J. Jinks, I talked with J.J., but I didn't deal with the paying him back part of it.
But the firm still had to pay him back for the lies that Alex Murdaugh told, correct? And for the theft.
Correct.
All right, keep going if you would, please.
The Christiani matter is still ongoing.
All right, keep going if you would, please.
And then Randy Drawdy, that matter's over. Tommy Moore, I've dealt with him. His money's back in trust where it's supposed to be.
All right. Tommy Moore was a highway patrolman that got injured in the line of duty, correct?
He was,
And Alex lied to him and took his money, correct?
correct. This is not all of them either.
So that's the ones for now, correct? That's the ones that are on that list that's been admitted to evidence here, correct?
Correct, but there's a good many more than this.
conversations with the defendant that back around the time of the recession that he had gotten into some land deals that had gotten him some financial issues.
I think it was squeezing him, yes.
And then not long after that, he had some big cases such as the Arthur Badger case and the Pinckney UPS case and the Plyler case, in which he got a large amount of fees from very large recoveries, correct?
Badger was the UPS, Pinckney was the tire case.
Okay.
But yeah, he got very big fees.
All right. And you thought that with all those fees that you knew who he got because he's your partner and you get to see the books. You're the treasurer of the firm or have been for an extended period. Is that correct?
For the old firm, yes.
And you thought that the money that he legitimately got from those cases had solved those problems because it was a lot, wasn't it?
I think I, along with everybody else, thought that he was totally out of any debt.
But on
to
top,
speak of.
but you've come to find out on top of the fees that he got, he also stole millions from those clients, correct?
Yes, sir.
It wasn't enough for him, was it?
Clearly not.
I'm almost done. Going back to that scene that you went to. You didn't see any blood on Alex Murdaugh that night, did you?
No, sir.
And when you went back the next day, you went back because y'all had attempted to call, y'all had called the coroner to get the names, and he had given you the names of some companies that their job is to come out and help clean up scenes like this, correct?
That's correct.
And y'all had called them, but nobody called back, and you just felt like you had to do something, so you went to the scene. Is that right?
Well, we were trying to also see what we could find out, if there was anything that we could do to lend assistance. I mean, this was something that was, I mean, everything stopped.
Everything stopped.
The whole world did.
And being a friend like people would be and just trying to do whatever you could, correct?
Friend and, you know, we're lawyers. We try to figure out what happened to things.
And you went in that feed room and observed the things that you saw.
Did.
And you also ended up getting blood on your sleeves, correct?
I did. I didn't know
Up
it.
high, correct?
On my shoulder areas and on my pants.
I asked you a little bit about the defendant's cell phone use. Was it like him to have very short phone calls, or was he one to talk for a while?
I mean, he would cut you off with one phone call coming in on top of another. He'd call you about something and say, "Oh, I'll call you back," and click it off, and you know.
But he'd start talking about something, right?
Yeah, but I mean, he would. It was regular.
It was regular. He would typically talk for more than a minute, though.
I mean,
said
I would
that, correct?
assume so. I mean, most people, a minute is not much of a conversation.
It's not much of a conversation just for a minute, is it?
No.
The night of the murders, did you see a golf cart up at the Moselle residence
I saw one in front of their house.
in front of the house?
Yeah, if you drove up the driveway, it was over to the left.
It was parked in front of the house?
It was parked off to the left side of the house.
Going back to September, and y'all find out about the Ferris fees, and y'all find out about Fake Forge, and y'all have a meeting of partners without Alec there and without Randy there, correct?
Well, first of all, on the 2nd, which was Thursday,
Right.
when the stuff with Forge came up and you started looking down, when I made the phone call to Tommy Moore, and first thing Jeannie did was start grabbing our check. All we could see was our end of it. So if a check was written off of our trust account or our operating account, but these were mostly trust checks, if it was written off of a trust account, we could get a copy of our check. we didn't know where it had gone from there. And we could see the disbursement sheets, and we could tell where they were deposited by looking at the back of the check, which you don't normally do. I mean, it's just not. And when you started seeing commonality to it, and then but the more thing was concrete. I mean, there was just no way that money couldn't have been written out because it was being held. He had an ongoing workers' comp claim that was a statutory lien. You couldn't give him the money. And
Bottom line is, without rehashing the whole story for the jury again, y'all knew he had been stealing at that point.
that's when we found out, and then I met
Didn't know how much. In fact, you found out a whole lot later,
a
correct?
whole lot. We had about 6 at that time. I met with our president that night and Ronnie Crosby and set up a meeting for the next morning, and we met, and then Randy was tied up and then came, and at that point it was unanimous, and then Randy and Danny went and talked to him.
All right. And then when confronted
He
with
admitted
that,
it.
and he was forced to resign, is that correct? Or y'all terminated him?
Well, he could either resign or be terminated, but it was a 30-second decision.
And what day was that when that happened?
That was Friday.
What day? Do you remember?
That would have been September the 3rd.
Third?
And we immediately started into all the things you have to do when you find out that a lawyer's been stealing in your firm, which has been absolute teetotal pure hell since then.
So everything was coming home to roost. The storm was arriving again for Alec on September 3rd when y'all confronted him. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I mean, it was over.
And then on September 4th, what happened? What did you hear about?
I had spoken to Mr. Griffin just to let him know that we had terminated him. He already knew, and about 11:30, 12 o'clock, whatever time it was, I was on a tractor, and he called me and said, "You're not going to believe what happened." And I thought, my first response was, "Don't tell me that jackass killed himself."
Right.
And he said, "No, somebody shot him." And I just said, "I don't believe that." It's
You don't
bullshit.
believe that. A lot of people thought right away that, oh my gosh, the real killers are back. Correct? The chickens were home to roost again for Alec, and all of a sudden he's a victim again, correct?
Objection, Your Honor, to what other people think.
Objection's overruled.
I went to the scene. I went straight to the scene, but I didn't believe it.
You didn't believe it because
No.
you have training as a lawyer, right?
I don't know whether it was intuition, training, whatever. I just didn't believe it.
And what did you see at the scene that confirmed that this time?
I got
when
out.
It didn't work.
Danny and Ronnie were there and standing there, and I said, I don't buy it. And we walked up towards the car, and I think I said it's got run flat tires, and the tire's not flat. Before we got to it, Ronnie said it doesn't even have a spare. And then when we got up to it, you could see at 9 o'clock where somebody had stabbed the tire. And we hung around there, and then when Sled showed up, I think it was actually David Owens showed up, or Ryan Kelly showed up, one of them, and that's when we told him we had fired him the day before. And what had happened, we were in consultation with a lawyer we had to hire on Friday to figure out what to do and how to do it. And when this happened, we thought they needed to know.
And you were told that Alec claimed at the scene that he was shot by some unknown assailant, correct?
That was the story.
But
I
you
just-
knew this scene had been manufactured by Alec, correct, when you arrived there?
I didn't know that. I suspected. It just didn't look like, I mean, it was a shiny Mercedes black car with no holes in it, a single shot. There's the back hatch isn't open. There's no nothing. I mean, it just doesn't look right.
And just when accountability is arriving again, the defendant manufactures himself being a victim, correct?
That's what it turned out to be.
Thank you, Mr. Ball.
Redirect.
Briefly, Your Honor. Mr. Ball, to your knowledge, has the law firm, PMPED, repaid all the money to the clients that's owed, as well as insurance company have pitched in?
To this point, we're holding some money as of 2 weeks ago, and in one of the matters, we're trying to get that money returned. We're having to go through a PR.
And the list of names that you read off, those folks, if they were entitled to the money now, they've received it? Is that right?
The people on that list have, yes, and there's a bunch more that have as well.
And the law firm is currently out a lot of money. Is that correct?
We are.
As a result of Alex?
Well, the law firm and the partners in the law firm.
Yeah.
We've had to pony it out of our pocket.
Sure. You personally have had to pony up?
Yes, sir, along with my partners.
And when Alec was resigned or terminated in September, he had some cash flow coming into the firm that the firm was able to keep and use that to pay some of the claims.
Well, no, sir. All of our funds, doesn't matter what I earn until it's declared at the end of the year, it's law firm money.
No, I understand that. So law firm money earned off Alec's cases, that was the firm money when he left?
Well,
we're talking a couple of $1 million?
First of all the cases are owned by the law firm. They're not Mark's cases, they're not Alec's cases. They're law firm cases. Cases that Alec was working on generated monies, and we internally decided a formula that we were going to use, because people had to complete those cases, and we've allocated much more than ordinarily. Our expenses are taken out in a different way, but we allocated a bunch of money to paying those. Yes,
I understand, but the income from those cases north of $2 million, perhaps?
Yes, sir.
And your firm and Jeannie Seconder and others have cooperated with SLED and the Attorney General's office in their investigation of Alec's misdeeds in relation to those client matters, have they not?
We have.
And as a result of, you're aware that Alex has 90+ pending charges against him for financial, the stuff you just testified about, right?
Yes, sir.
And you've been subpoenaed here today to testify in the murder case, correct?
I've been subpoenaed since this trial started.
And you know this is the murder case?
Yes, sir.
Now, immediately after the murder of Maggie and Paul, and you talked about Alex's demeanor, did he come to work and was able to work on cases?
No, sir. He came. He was out for a while. I think he went to his in-laws and stayed. He didn't. After the funeral was either Friday or Saturday, I can't remember. And then Randolph died on Thursday after this, and then Randolph's was on Sunday, and Alex he was staying between Randy, John Marvin, and whoever else, his mother's house. I think he went to his in-laws. I know he went down to visit with his brother-in-law and sister-in-law.
Sure. And
but no, he was not. There was a period of time he wasn't doing it. Might come by, and he would be in his office, generally looking at sympathy notes.
And from your observation, was he in any frame of mind to do any productive legal work the month of June?
No.
The month of July?
We sat down and talked about it as partners, and not with Alec, about what we were going to do, because there's deadlines and things that have to be done, and so we were going to try to figure out how we were going to delicately kind of start stepping in on some of his cases and making sure everything was being done according to what needed to be.
And I think you testified about how the firm, partners in the firm, lawyers in the firms, were reaching out and using your resources to try to find out perhaps who played a role in killing Maggie and Paul.
We absolutely were.
And And but were you careful not to go out and do the investigation yourself and just relay the information back to SLED?
Right. I mean, we weren't trying to be private eyes or any of that. We were just trying to see, and I relayed numerous things to the various officers, and I would preface it by, I don't know whether this means anything, but you never know. I mean.
And was, to your knowledge, was information being relayed through Alex attorneys to pass on to SLED?
Well, I know I dealt with you on various things up until the stealing.
Sure. And to your knowledge, was Alex consenting and cooperating with SLED in their investigation?
As far as I knew, yes. I mean, I wasn't with him during those interviews or anything else, but as far as I knew, he was. And I would ask him, you know, where we stand, you know, have you heard anything?
Right.
You know.
And were you aware that Alex Buster put up a reward?
I was.
And are you also aware that when Paul was criminally charged in the voting case, Alex came under criticism for interfering in the investigation? You remember that?
I was.
And in fact, there's been some pretty public allegations about that, about Alex, that had surfaced before Maggie and Paul had been murdered.
Absolutely. I mean, they were criticizing him for advising people of stuff, but I'm a lawyer, I'm a parent, daddy. One of my kids has some problem or gets accused of something, or one of my friends' kids, I'm going to put my lawyer hat on and advise them to be quiet until their parents get there and get counsel if I think it's a serious matter.
Sure. You were asked about Alex's cell phone use and about whether he would take the phone down to the kennel. Have you ever been down to the kennels with Alex?
Yep.
Okay. Have you been riding the property with Moselle with Alex?
I have, not a whole lot. I mean, as time went on, you know, our families got older, and you just, when you don't have children, it's you're doing a lot more things together on the weekends and stuff. And as your children get older and they're in college, and he was going to Walford and different places where Buster was, and
sure,
you know, your interests are different as well. But yeah, I would occasionally, or if he was building something, he might ask me what I thought about it or show me something. I mean, I saw his duck pond and, you know, rode around the property several times.
Was cell phone coverage spotty down at the shed in the kennels?
It can be, it varies. I mean, it can be. I don't remember specifically where and what. You know, out where I live, if I go in my house with a metal roof, this morning somebody was trying to talk to me and I had to walk out on the porch. Other days I can talk just fine in my house. I live 8 miles, 9 miles from where this place is, and I don't know whether it's a metal roof or whether I'm just at the end of wherever a cell tower is, but out in my area, which is Rum Gully,
sure,
it can be spotty.
And you mentioned about spending time at Moselle and when the kids were younger, before Alec got Moselle, you had a farm.
I do.
And would Alec bring the boys over to hunt on your property?
Mostly Paul.
Mostly Paul.
Yeah, I mean, Buster would come some, but Buster was older, and then obviously when Buster started college, he wasn't around as much, but Paul was a very avid hunter and was over at either my place or Ronnie's place a lot.
And he and Alec were together a lot doing that?
Paul?
Or he and Alec, he and Paul, Alec and Paul together a lot?
Yeah. Yeah. And Paul was with his grandfather a lot.
And I think you mentioned that Paul would leave stuff over there?
All three of them, but, you know, they would just, they'd leave a gun, they'd leave a coat, they'd leave a flashlight, maybe all three. And it was just sort of a running joke that you had to kind of go around and gather up their stuff after they left. And that was just them.
And did you remember one time Paul had left a gun over there for a couple of months?
He did, and Alec left one time, I believe, and I cleaned it and put it up, and he started asking around where his gun was, and we just sort of played with him a little bit and then gave it back to him.
Right. I think you testified moving September the 4th. You had gotten word about a shooting involving Alec, and I think your words were that jackass had killed himself.
That was what I thought immediately.
And why did you think that?
Because of all that had gone on. We had terminated him, or he had resigned the day before. This financial stuff was starting to come out, and I thought, he'd lost 2 family members, and now he's got no job, and it seemed feasible. I mean, I had been concerned about his mental health from the time of the murders up until then. In fact, I had suggested that he go see somebody for grief counseling. We were all grieving their loss, and it's one of those deals that you can tell when somebody's not hitting on all cylinders, and he obviously was. I would come by his office and he would be crying. Or I would ask him something. I remember him asking me one time when he was going through he had a stack of sympathy cards, and he said, should I send them all back a note? And I said, Alec, people don't send you sympathy cards to, get a note back from you. There's no way in the world you can do that. And he said he missed
he was terminated from the firm, and you were concerned about perhaps what he might do. Did you ever think maybe he'll go kill a family member? Did that ever cross your mind?
No. You talking about when we terminated him?
Yes, sir.
By then, Maggie and Paul had been killed.
Well, he had family out there.
He did. I never thought of any of that. Listen, when September the 2nd hit, it changed everything that I knew about Alec. I would have never believed that a guy that, was like family would have ever stolen from me, would have stolen from his family, would have stolen from his clients, or any of that. And so immediately, you've got this rage, this emotion that you've got, and then on the 3rd, we go through this whole ordeal of the termination, and then the 4th it hits, and you're like, did the jackass kill himself because of anything else? And then as time progressed on, and you see the scope of it, I don't know the guy that after September the 3rd and leading out, I don't know who that guy is. That's not Alec that I knew,
right,
and Alec that I loved, and Alec that all of us loved. Did he have imperfections? You bet. Did he do things that aggravated the hell out of me? You bet. But you don't kick your brother out the door because they snore at night, or they've done things that aggravate you. You get past it. But when they do things that are criminal, and they do things that affect not only him, but he's torn down an entire legacy, a law firm. I've spent 34 years, or 33 years, I guess, in this one place. It's the only law firm that I've ever worked at. I put everything in it. It's all my children have known, my family's known, and it's gone. We had to change the name. We've had to do all these things because of his acts on this financial stuff. And when it comes to that, I'm mad as hell. You just don't know how mad I am. But on the other hand, I'm not saying that because he did that, he's done what he's accused of. And so that's sort of the bottom line of it. His actions he was doing that way back, but we never knew it. Sure. And when we found out about it, it makes you doubt everything, and it's just human nature. But I don't have one shred of anything. All I can do is just point to what I saw.
And you pointed to the roadside shooting and what you saw, you thought that jackass tried to kill himself.
Absolutely, and I may not have said jackass, but it's about as
And
non-church
logically,
as I want
to
to get
you,
it.
it made sense why he would want to kill himself in that moment.
Sure. I mean, he'd lost, as far as I was concerned, he'd lost everything. He'd lost his job, and he'd lost, forget the job, forget the money, forget what's going to happen to him. He'd lost his wife and his child. And
Are you aware that he had $12 million of life insurance?
I didn't know what he had. I assumed he had some life insurance, but no. I mean, I never had that conversation with him, and quite frankly, I'd have to see it to really believe it.
Okay. Thank you. That's all the questions.
Recross.
I think you just said that what you know now about this man who'd been your partner and friend for 34 years causes you to question everything you thought you knew about him. Isn't that right?
It does.
You were asked about all those clients that had to be repaid money, and none of that money came from him, did it?
No, sir.
Y'all had to pay that money, right?
We did.
How much?
I would say at this point, probably north of $10 or $11 million. Now, insurance paid for some of that, but I mean, there's been a substantial chunk of that came out of our pocket.
You were asked about Alec having some cases that were coming in, but you explained, though, that this is June, and that disbursement's not going to come to him until December. He's not going to be able to get that money until December, correct? Any of what he's entitled to, which isn't all of it, correct? Because it belongs to the firm.
Right. Everything belongs to the firm until the end of the year when you meet, and then you divide up money and
that's
we
why
have
he
a
stole the
formulation.
Ferris fees in March, because he needed the money right then.
I would assume so. I mean, the money was gone, and it was paid in 3 checks.
You said that in the month after the murders, he wasn't really working on cases, but he sure managed to arrange to cover those Ferris fees to pay him back so that everyone would forget about it, didn't he? Or not all of it. He managed to do that, didn't he?
Yeah, well, part of it. I mean, I think there was $192,000 that didn't.
That he convinced Chris Wilson to cover for him.
Convinced, or Chris had to cover it, one of the two.
You were asked about him cooperating with law enforcement in the murders. But he never told law enforcement that he was down at the kennels just minutes with the victims before they died. He never told law enforcement that, did he? I think it's responsive to Redirection.
You can testify if you know.
I don't know what he told law enforcement other than what's been out there in the public.
Well, let me ask you this. He denied to you 3 times that he ever went to those kennels, did he not?
He did.
His buddy, his friend, and his law partner of 34 years told you 3 times, I was never there.
That's correct.
And you know now that's a lie.
When I saw the video a month or so ago.
Thank you, Mr. Ball.
You step down.
Thank you.
Let me call your next witness.
Your Honor, the defense calls Dawes Cooke. Dawes Cooke.
Dawes Cooke.
Take an exhibit with it. You place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. You swear the testimony that you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
You'll have a seat up on the witness stand. And please pull that microphone to you and adjust it so that it's your height and you can talk into it. You'll state your name and spell your last name.
It's Morris Dawes Cooke Jr., and Cooke is C-O-O-K-E.
Thank you. Would you please tell the jury a little bit about yourself?
I'm a lawyer, practice in Charleston, South Carolina with firm Barnwell, Whaley, Patterson, and Helms. I've been doing it since graduated from law school in 1979, clerked for a judge for a year, and I've been with the same law firm since 1980. And I practice mainly civil litigation.
And do you primarily represent plaintiffs or defendants?
I don't mind representing plaintiffs, but most of the time I'm representing defendants.
All right. And do you know Alex Murdaugh?
I do.
How do you know him?
Through practice of law. I've had cases against him over the years.
Okay. And have you represented him before?
No. Well, I mean, now I do, but I did not previously to this, right?
Right. What was the scope of your representation?
I'm defending him in the boat accident case.
Okay. And when were you asked to join his team?
In December of 2020, I got a call from Danny Henderson and asked me if I would become involved. The case had already been going on for a year and a half or so at that time.
Okay. And did he have other attorneys representing him at that time?
Yes. Yeah, the Hainsworth firm, John Tiller in particular, was representing him.
Okay. And what, if any, understanding did you have as to why you were asked to join the defense team?
Well, John was sick, as I think everybody knows now, and would be undergoing treatment from time to time, and he was unsure as to whether he'd be able to cover everything by himself. And so I was asked, one, to help him, sort of be a second chair for him, and also be a backup for times when he would not be able to participate.
Okay. And would you please describe for the jury your assessment of the merits of the claim against Alex in June of 2021?
Well, I think I was the one that coined the phrase negligent parenting that Mark mentioned during his testimony. The claim at that time was that Alec was responsible for the boat accident because he knew that Paul was using his brother's ID. And I mean, I didn't think that there was a claim in South Carolina law for that, so I sort of facetiously called it negligent parenting. So we felt that it was a defensible claim. I always sort of felt that lurking out there was going to be what's now negligent entrustment, that eventually they would allege negligence for having let him use the boat, which is the substance of the claim now. But even that, we always felt like it was a defensible claim. That I think the big picture that occurred to me was to hold him liable for that would be to hold him to a higher standard than any of the other parents of the other folks that were in the boat, which
Okay.
anybody who's raised kids knows that that can be difficult.
Okay. And what was your assessment as to Alex's financial exposure as a result of this case in June of 2021?
Well, it was unknown, and I'll have to say that was I didn't even really pay attention to that issue at the time. I think there was still a declaratory judgment action pending that was going to decide whether there was some additional insurance. I knew that the one policy was relatively limited. So I wouldn't have said that he had no personal exposure, but that was certainly not the focus of our attention at that time.
Right. And were there motions pending when you joined the case?
Yes, several motions pending. For some time, there had been a motion by Parkers to change venue. They wanted it out of Hampton and into Beaufort County, and there was also, they had made a motion to amend their answer to plead admiralty law, which would have some benefits over South Carolina law for the defense. And then there was this, there may have been some motions to compel discovery with Parkers. I don't really remember specifically, and I think in October of 2020, there had been a motion to compel the answers to interrogatories and request to produce to Alec.
And have you reviewed that motion to compel?
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna, I'll know on. Yeah, it's plaintiff's exhibit, not plaintiff, I'm sorry, State's Exhibit 402. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. And this is just the first page, but do you recognize this as the motion?
That's the motion. And then
Okay.
I think attached to that were 2 sets of interrogatories and a set of requests to produce.
All right, so I'm gonna, these are the interrogatories. Would you just briefly explain to the jury what interrogatories and requests for production are?
Right. Well, we call it discovery. The rules of civil procedure provide various means of obtaining information from the other side. So interrogatories is questions that you can ask, and then requests to produce are documents and other materials that you can require be provided.
And the supplemental ones that we're looking at right here, were those seeking financial information, Mr. Murdaugh?
Yes.
Okay. And the objections, if you'll, well, the answers right here to the interrogatories, and then the objection right here. Have you reviewed those?
Yes.
Okay. In your practice, are those common objections?
Right. That's this was done before I was involved in the case, but those are the exact objections that I would have made. These financial discovery, it's sort of the plaintiff's lawyer's way of saying I'm really serious, and I'll call it intimidation, not in a pejorative way, but it's meant to really worry the defendants, and it's very common. And the typical response from the defendant would be just like this, and that is, we object, it's not relevant, you haven't gotten a judgment against us, you don't need to know how much money we have unless and until you do get a judgment. The comeback to that is, well, your net worth could be relevant on punitive damages. If it goes to the jury, a jury could consider your wealth as a factor in awarding punitive damages. And so 95% of the time you work out some agreement to provide a financial statement, but I would never have produced all of these details at this stage of litigation as a defense lawyer.
Okay. After joining the defense team, did you have meetings or communications with other members of the defense team?
Yes, regularly. And I have to admit, there's a lot I didn't remember, so I've gone back and I've looked at my emails, my time records. And we defense lawyers, we measure our lives in tenth of an hour increments, and we have to write everything down. So it was helpful for me to go back and look through my time records as well as emails to see who all was included. But yes.
Okay. And was Alex often CC'd on the emails?
Oh yeah.
Okay. All right. Did you ever participate in any Zoom meetings with the defense team?
Yes. The one there's more than one, but the first one I remember was April 15 of 2021. I was just sort of getting involved. I don't think I'd made a formal appearance in the case yet, but there was a Zoom conference. And I remember Alec was included on the Zoom invitation, but I honestly can't recall whether he was in the meeting itself. I remember others who were in the meeting.
Okay. And what was the purpose of that Zoom conference?
It was really to kind of orient me, and also there were some motions scheduled in May. So it was just to get me oriented, talk about what the important issues in the case were and the things that we'd be focusing on.
Okay. And having attended that meeting, what, if any, understanding did you have as to the biggest issues facing Alex at the upcoming motions hearing? Right, and
I had to go back and look at my notes to refresh my memory on that, but it was the upcoming, as far as I was concerned, it was the venue issue, whether the case was going to be transferred back to Beaufort, because we didn't want it transferred back. We wanted it to stay in Hampton. We thought that the plaintiff wanted it to stay there too, but he was wavering, and there was some thought that he might consent, and we didn't want him to consent. So that was a big issue. And then we spent a lot of time talking about admiralty. You know, was it beneficial to have admiralty as opposed to state common law? So that was, as far as the hearing, that was the important part of the conversation. That was about a 2-hour meeting, and we talked a lot about experts, depositions that needed to be taken, and so forth as well.
And after that meeting, based on those conversations, what, if any, understanding did you have as to the level of concern the defense team had regarding the motion to compel the financial information?
Really none. I wasn't dealing with Mark directly on that. John Tiller was doing it, and as far as we were concerned, that was something that they were going to work out, but the focus on the hearings was going to be on these other substantive issues.
Did you ever have a concern that the motion to compel would be granted in total?
What's the question?
If he personally had expected the motion to compel to be granted.
Also 401 and 402.
I sustained the objection.
When was the motion to compel originally scheduled to be heard?
It was in May, I'm going to say May 10th, sometime in that area.
Okay. And did that go forward?
No, I think John, some of his treatment had to be rescheduled, and so they agreed to continue the hearing.
Okay. And when was it rescheduled for?
June. And I don't recall the exact date, but maybe the 10th or so.
Okay. And at any point prior to the motion to compel hearing that was scheduled, did anything change in terms of your understanding that would make you think the defense team was concerned about the motion to compel?
No, I filed my formal notice of appearance so that I could be at the hearing. I think I actually did that in May before the first hearing. And so I was prepared to be there to argue whatever needed to be argued. But as I go back and I look at my notes and my preparation, it was on the venue issue and the admiralty issue.
What, if any, factors did you consider when you made an assessment about Alex's personal financial exposure?
I mean, I never take a case lightly. I mean, Mark certainly is a very good lawyer, and obviously a very emotional case. So I won't say that we weren't concerned about it, but we knew that there had already been some other settlements, which we would have gotten credit for that. There were just a number of factors that made us feel like this was a defensible case and that it was not an existential threat to Alex.
Okay. Are you aware as to whether or not an order was eventually issued regarding the motion to compel?
Yes, what we call a Form 4 order was issued around October 7th or 8th of 2021.
Okay. What is your understanding of that order?
I've got it right here. I mean, it said that John Tiller had not been able to get the information and that, well, it says right here, the court at a hearing on plaintiff's motion to compel filed October 16, 2020 was informed that defendant's attorney Tiller, because of circumstances beyond his control, is unable to gather and provide the necessary information to answer the requested interrogatories at this time. Once this information is made available to attorney Tiller, the court will schedule a hearing on this motion to compel if necessary, which means that John Tiller was going to get the information, and then if he couldn't work it out with Mark, then they would have a hearing on the motion to compel.
So was it your understanding the court was ordering Alex to produce all of the financial information requested?
No, that's not what it said.
Okay. just one or two more. Did you expect any cataclysmic event on June 10th regarding Alex having to give over financial documents?
No.
Okay. And do you recognize Mr. Tinsley? Do you know him?
Yep.
Do you see him here?
Yes.
Mr. Tinsley, can you stand up? Oh, okay. Did you ever speak with him during the case?
Yes.
You did?
A number of
Okay.
times, yeah.
At all about the motion to compel?
No. Not that I remember. If he says I did, I couldn't deny it, but I don't remember it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
By the state.
Like you said, the motion's meant to really worry the defendants, right? Those are your exact words, wasn't it?
Could you repeat that?
You just testified that the motion to get those financial information is meant to really worry the defendants. Those are
Right.
your exact words, correct?
Always, yeah.
Okay. All right, and were you present at the trial lawyers conference when Alex Murdaugh came up and towered over Mark Tinsley and said, "What's up, Bo? What are you doing?"
No,
Were
I
you
don't
present at that?
I don't get invited to that one.
Okay. I think you did. But you weren't there when that happened, were you?
No.
You were present for when he said that to that man right there about the boat case. "What you doing, Bo? What's up?"
Objection.
I was not there.
Basis for the objection.
Foundation.
The objection is overruled.
And you did not.
Said he wasn't there.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. All right. And you didn't file your notice of appearance into this case until May of 2021, is that right?
I think that's about right, yeah.
Because you were actually representing other parties, and that had to be resolved before you could get involved with Alec, is that correct?
That's part of the reason our firm was, yeah.
Right, so you couldn't have been, with the conflict, heavily involved in any discussions that were going on between Mark Tinsley and John Tiller and Amy Bauer prior to moving into May, is that right?
That wasn't exactly the reason. The conflict had been waived, but I just wasn't involved in that. That was something John and Mark were handling.
Right, and when John, in May of 2021, asked for continuance of that hearing on which the motion to compel the financial information was part of, he didn't offer you as any sort of backup because you weren't fully on the defense team at that point, is that correct?
I think I had planned to notice my appearance before that hearing, and I can't recall whether I didn't do it because the case was continued, but I would have appeared at the hearing.
You were asked about insurance coverage, and you're talking about the Philadelphia policy, right? That there was a declaratory judgment.
Right.
And the defense team knew that they weren't going to have any obligation to cover Alec in this, correct? I mean, it was very unlikely. And in fact, ultimately, Judge Sherry Lydon in the federal district court denied that Philadelphia had to cover Alec one penny, correct?
Yeah, I'll have to say I wasn't following that, but that's pretty much my understanding. It was a long shot that there would be coverage.
And when you were at this point in time in June of 2021, just getting on the defense team, you certainly didn't know anything about his true financial condition, did you?
No.
You didn't know he'd been stealing money for years and years, did you?
No.
You didn't know that he was broke, did you?
No.
You didn't know he had misappropriated funds and was scrambling to try to replace those before people found out, did you?
No.
You were asked about the hearing on June 10th that ultimately was continued because of these terrible murders, correct?
Correct.
That's your understanding. The
That was
murders
my-
happened and that hearing got continued because, of course, who's going to have a hearing in the wake of these terrible events, correct?
Yeah, I think Mark agreed to continue the hearing.
course.
Right.
Yeah, that got continued, right?
Right.
And even as a civil defense attorney, even if you believe that a claim down the line may be defensible, that still doesn't change the discovery process in a civil case that goes on, correct?
That's true.
I mean, discovery still can happen and is going to happen.
Right.
Regardless of whether or not the case settles or goes to trial or whatever happens, correct?
Yeah, it's still going on.
And that's how civil cases, typically how cases work in court, is that both parties have to share a lot of information, and if one party doesn't want to share it, the other party can ask the judge to order it, correct?
That's right.
All right, and that goes on regardless of whether or not the claim is ultimately going to be successful. That's part of the initial process.
Right.
All right. And that was on the table for June 10th. That was one of the things that was on the table, correct?
The financial?
Yes.
Yeah, and then there was the other interrogatories too.
And there was
that
a
they
number of
wanted
other
answered.
things as well.
Right.
All right. And if that hearing had gone forward, there could have been an order issued compelling that process, correct?
Could have been.
Could have been.
Yeah.
All right. And so once that happened, once that order gets issued, that's going to set in motion a train that's going to have to come to a conclusion in a court of law, correct?
If that happened, right. Ultimately, the judge is going to decide what has to be produced and what doesn't.
That's right. Thank you, Mr. Cooke.
Thanks.
Just a few. Mr. Waters just asked you for your opinion as to the June 10th hearing, and based on your 40 years of experience defending
I did not
cases.
ask for her for the opinion. I just asked what potentially could happen.
Let me hear the question.
Based on your 40 years of experience, what was your opinion of the likelihood that the order to compel would be granted?
Objection, Your Honor.
Let me ask you this. Just because it's possible that the order could have been granted, does that make it plausible?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Okay. All right. Yes. If the judge had ordered the documents to be produced at the June 10th hearing, would Alec have had to turn them over immediately?
No.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Anything further?
If that had happened, it would have set in a process, set in motion a process, though, would it not have?
You're talking
Let me
about
rephrase that question.
If he'd ordered production of all of the documents that were requested?
Right.
Yeah. That would have been part of the process, right?
It would have started a process, an order of a judge, correct?
That's true, yeah.
It would have happened eventually if the judge had ordered that, correct?
If he ordered production of all the documents, right.
Nothing further, thank you.
Step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Your next witness.
Please, the court, Your Honor. The next witness is an expert. It's going to take a while. We can begin and break for lunch, and then I'm do whatever you want to do.
We'll go for about a half an hour, then break. As we anticipate him, however, let's all stand and stretch for a moment.
Xerxes.
You will repeat that, Mr. Harpootlian?
Ken Xerxes.
Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, sir. You'll have a seat right up here on the witness stand. Have a seat and adjust that microphone to where you can speak into it well. And if you would, please state your name and spell your last name for us, please.
Yes, ma'am. Kenneth, last name is Xerxes, Z like zebra, E-R-C-I-E. Good morning, Your Honor.
Mr. Xerxes,
Yes, sir.
please tell the jury a little bit about yourself. Where do you live?
In Madison, Connecticut.
Okay. And what do you do in Madison, Connecticut?
Currently live with my wife, and my son lives up the street from us. Currently employed by the Henry Seeley Institute of Forensic Science at the University of New Haven as the director of training. In addition to that, I'm also on staff at the university.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well. Maybe it's just me, but
I'm also on staff at the university as an adjunct professor in various forensic science disciplines.
okay, let's talk a little bit about your background. You've been involved in law enforcement in your life?
Yes, sir, I have.
Tell the jury, please, where you began.
In 1974, I became an officer with the New Haven Police Department, also in Connecticut. Was promoted to the rank of detective. Most of my career there, for my 11-year duration prior to retiring, was with the Identifications Unit, responsible for crime scene processing, evidence collection, photography, and preliminary examination of physical evidence that's found at a crime scene. After that, I retired based on a disability. I was injured and was almost immediately hired by the state of Connecticut at the Forensic Science Laboratory located in Meriden.
I'm sorry, and tell me what that was again. What was that position?
The second career, if you will, was at the Department of Public Safety, currently called the Division of Scientific Services Forensic Science Laboratory. Originally brought in as a latent fingerprint analyst, also doing footwear and tire track examination, as well as becoming the senior person as far as crime scene related activity that the laboratory would respond to assist investigative agencies. Over a 29-year career, I was promoted through the ranks and eventually retired as director of the laboratory.
And that's director of the Division of Scientific Services for the state of Connecticut.
Yes, sir.
And in your duties there, you indicated you started off not as a supervisor or as a supervisor?
Not as a supervisor, as a criminalist, right, with a specific function.
And a criminalist doing what kind of forensic work?
Starting primarily with fingerprints, latent fingerprint identification, and all the processing techniques involved. Because I had also experience doing footwear and tire track from the police department, I was given that task. And again, because of the crime scene background, also ended up as one of the senior people going to the major crime scenes when the laboratory services would be requested, and eventually ended up supervising the photography section because of that type of background as well.
So photography is important in processing a crime scene?
Absolutely.
Is that just for fingerprints or footprints or tire tracks or everything?
It involves the entire scene. It's the only way to bring the crime scene before a jury after the incident has occurred. Right? So it can be reviewed or seen.
We're going to talk about
intact.
this a little bit later once I've had you qualified in these different areas. But after, and how long were you at the Division of Scientific Services?
For 29 years.
Right. Now also, and you ultimately became the supervisor of that department for the state of Connecticut?
The director of the laboratory.
Okay, so you were there from July of '84 to October of 2012.
Yes, sir.
And what did you do after 2012?
I've been an adjunct professor at 4 different universities, off and on during that period, as well as approximately 20 to 25 years prior to retiring. I maintain that. I've also had a private consultant business that I've kind of let go by the wayside a little bit.
So what's the Henry C. Lee Institute of Forensic Science?
It's located at the University of New Haven. It's a separate entity under the university, and we're involved in doing scholarships, training and education, providing consultant work in cases, whether it's for the defense or the prosecution, but more to stay involved with the community and provide modern technologies.
Okay, and then you're the owner and principal analyst for Forensic Consultants of New England, LLC. What is that?
Again, that was the private business that I had on the side for doing consulting work.
Are you still doing that?
Technically, this case falls under that today.
Okay. Now, what's your educational background?
As far as criminal justice and forensic science, I have an associate's degree in criminal justice administration, a bachelor of science in what was called police science, basically a hybrid between administration and the forensic applications or sciences, and a master's of science in forensic science.
That's all from the University of New Haven.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you have a resume with several pages of different teaching things you've done. I'm not going to go into those in detail. Now, you have taught a number of courses, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Everything from footprints to bloodstains to tire tracks to crime scene supervision to, I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. Have you ever been qualified by any court to testify about fingerprint identification, that is in a federal or state court in this country?
Yes, sir, I have.
And how many times?
Approximately 300.
300 times. And can you remember all the courts or several of the courts?
I can remember the states that they were in, but the specific ones, probably not.
Connecticut, I suppose.
Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Massachusetts, Florida.
That's enough. Okay, and how many times have you been qualified on footprints, or the more technical would be, what would you call that?
Footwear tire track examination or imprint analysis.
Imprint analysis. How
Probably
many times?
about 200.
300 times you've been qualified by state or federal court to be an expert on that topic.
About 200 as far as footwear and tire track.
Okay. Now, what about, and maybe I'm getting this term wrong, crime scene management or crime scene analysis? You've taught courses on that, correct?
I've taught and been an active participant at crime scenes, yes.
Okay. How many times have you been qualified, if you have, by federal or state court to testify on that topic?
Qualified, probably 400.
400 times?
Yes, sir.
And you've testified?
Yes, sir.
And this is both state and federal courts?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, I would move to qualify him as an expert in fingerprint analysis, footprint analysis, tire print analysis, and crime scene analysis management. Sir, tell me what the term is. Make sure I'm not screwing this up. Crime scene.
It would be crime scene examination as an overarching title.
There you go. Crime scene. Whatever he just said.
If he said it, I didn't hear it. How many times have you been qualified in tire impressions?
Approximately 200.
For tire impressions? No.
Tire and footwear.
No question.
He's so qualified.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now let's talk a little bit about, I have a PowerPoint here somewhere. I believe I sent y'all last night. Yeah. Can we call that up, please? You prepared a PowerPoint for your testimony here today? Sir, you have a PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can we put that up on the screen, please?
Can you raise your voice any, sir?
I can, sir.
So, is this the PowerPoint?
It's the first slide, yes.
Okay, and what is this showing us?
Basically, it was put together just to give a quick demonstration on what can be done with physical evidence at a crime scene and some of the base requirements that are involved.
Okay. This says recording of imprint, impression evidence, seizure of item, photography, lifting methods, and enhancement. And that's sort of a guide about what we're about to see, correct?
Yes, it's also an outline of what could be done with physical evidence at a crime scene and then later on at the laboratory.
Okay. Next slide, please. Now, this says photographic evidence, enhanced photographs of the question imprint impression for use in inter-comparison examination with known footwear outsoles or transparencies of known footwear outsoles. Well, explain that. What does that mean?
With all types of evidence, especially at a crime scene, as I mentioned before, photography is one of the keys, documenting the evidence in place. In many cases, you can't take the evidence back to a laboratory, so you have to rely on the photographic images. If they're taken with quality equipment, quality cameras, and in a proper format, a lot of work can be done with them. They can be associated to a known and a question. Photography is still the key for bringing the scene either into the laboratory or into the courtroom.
And are there certain, and we're going to see this in just a minute, certain requirements, I guess is the right word to use, on how those photographs are taken, depending on what you want to use them for?
Correct. There are different types of photography, just as we have portrait photography here, the media that's present. All of that is a form of documentation.
Okay, we'll talk about that in just a minute. And by the way, inter-comparison examination with known footwear outsoles or transparencies of known footwear outsoles. What does that mean?
There's a difference between taking a picture of something and then taking a photograph for examination quality, where you do need the detail to find the individual characteristics that might be present for a comparison. And again, it would be a known, whatever the known object is, whether it's a shoe, a fingerprint, could be a tool mark, it could be any type of pattern, and the sample that's found at the scene, okay, or against the instrument that may have caused that mark. The more detailed the images, the better the quality of the examination, and the more reliable the showing of the detail and proportion. So the side-by-side comparison is your known and your question.
Okay, because most of these are basically eyeball examinations, either under a microscope or looking at it just with your naked eye, correct?
All of the above.
Right. Okay. Next, please. Photographic techniques, FUS. Tell us what that means.
It's just an acronym to help the photographer remember to do certain things, especially when it comes to analytical photographs. You want to take whatever the image on a picture or inside the viewfinder of the camera, such as a gentleman has, and fill that entire image that captures the picture. You're maximizing the amount of detail that can be retained either in a digital format or a film format. The opposite would be taking a medium close-up, where you show an overview, multiple items, or something as a wide-angle shot of the entire courtroom. So there's a whole series of photographs that go with this method. Secondly, using a scale. If it's going to be used for analysis, you want a known reference in there so that you can recreate the image later in a dark room or on a computer so that the image is now in life-size proportion. So again, if I have an article of footwear, I can place that or take a sample from it. That would be 1-to-1 or life-size. I can recreate the image, either taken from the crime scene or the standard, the photograph, using that scale to that same reference. I can also recreate that 1-to-1 so that I can get a size proportion, right, as part of the analysis. It would also be an elimination. If the sizes were different, it couldn't be from the same source. The side lighting is a lighting technique that's used. Right? When the photograph is taken, if it's an object of interest and if you're using it for analysis, you may want a side light coming in at different angles to show the different detail that might be there, especially in a three-dimensional picture. Two-dimensional, it helps, but it's not as critical. Right? And lastly, several shots. You want to take multiple exposures of each image. With digital photography today, it's a lot easier because the image pops up so you can see that you've captured it. In past technologies, you had a photograph on film and you couldn't see the result until you processed the film, which was usually long after you've left the scene or the incident. So there's several advantages to the newer technologies.
So this says special note, film plane must be level, parallel to the imprint impression.
Yes, sir.
What does that mean?
The film plane is actually the back of the camera. It's where the image is actually captured. That film plane, if my object is here, would have to be here. I want those two images parallel. It avoids distortion and vignetting. Okay, the way the angles may come up. If you think of a tall building, right, and you look up at it, the building tends to come together. The same thing happens with angular photography. Okay, there's distortion that occurs, and even in close-up images, right, by using the scales and making sure that your film plane is parallel to the object that you're taking, right, you try to avoid that distortion as one of the considerations. And again, it would give you a more accurate rendering.
So when you take this photograph, you can compare it to a footprint, a fingerprint, a tire track. You want it, the photograph to be, the camera's lens to be parallel to that, so you're looking straight down at it.
Yes, sir.
That's one of the shots you should get, but that's the most important shot.
For analytical quality imaging, yes.
Right. If you, I mean, you're not taking it to send home to mom. It's for analytical purposes, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then you have other shots from the side or whatever, and that helps you, if you see a detail, get more perspective on it, if you will.
It could, but it also shows the orientation to the surrounding area. And again, that three-shot sequence, close-up, medium close-up, and then an overview. You're telling a story through pictures.
So let me stop and sort of go off script for a second. You started with what police department and when?
City of New Haven.
And what was your role or job when you started?
Initially as a patrolman, doing patrol activities. Spent a year in the Corporation Council doing civil investigation. Unfortunately, I got hurt.
And
how did you get
hurt?
On a burglar on the premise call. I fell through a drywall and ended up destroying my left knee.
Okay, and so you had to leave the police department after that?
No, well, it was about 9 years later.
Okay, so did you continue to be a patrolman after hurt?
No, I was promoted and went into the identification unit after leaving the Corporation Council and was performing crime scene related activities, basic investigation.
So,
again,
so when you first started, I mean, you were a detective at that point?
when I first started as a patrol officer, was promoted to detective.
Okay, and when you're doing crime, responding to murder scenes or house breakings or whatever?
Yes, sir.
You were a detective at that point?
Plainclothes officer or detective, yes.
So when you responded to the scene, did you take a camera?
Yes, sir, always.
Okay, and did you follow FUS?
Yes, sir.
And so, I mean, this was required by procedure and policy at your department, correct?
Yes, and also the teaching in the specialized schools that I had been to.
Okay. And you started that in the 80s?
In the 70s.
70s, I'm sorry. So this is what you've done while you were a police officer for a span of decades, correct?
Yes, sir. I've also taught it.
Starting in the 70s?
Yes, sir.
So this isn't some newfound procedure. This is something you've done for 4 decades?
Correct.
Okay. Next, please. So this is use of a tripod when photographing evidence with detail. A tripod must be used.
It's recommended. It makes it more stable. You don't have to worry about even the pulse in your fingers. And depending on the length of the exposure that's necessary, causing any vibration or defocusing that might occur.
And this is a process or procedure, and this shows a guy shooting out in front, not straight down. That would be incorrect?
For a documentation or an analytical photograph, yes.
Okay.
What happens is his camera's at an angle. He's doing a flat object here, and again, the distortion effects that I explained earlier.
Okay. And this is also a procedure you followed for decades?
Yes, sir.
And is it a procedure you taught when you taught police officers?
Yes, sir.
And is it a procedure you heard about when you attended classes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, next, please. And what does this depict?
Here we have 2 examples of the position of a camera. All right, they're line drawings on a tripod showing the proper orientation to an object being photographed. Right, the film plane, even if the item is on an angle, the camera and the lens would also be on that same angle, right? Again, to avoid distortion.
So you ought to have a tripod, and it ought to be, the lens ought to be parallel to whatever it's shooting at.
It makes it easier to have the tripod, yes.
Right. Next. Is this demonstration the same thing?
It's a demonstration showing what happens when you don't do that. If you look at the object on the bottom, the black dots, you'll notice that they're distorted, right? They're not in proper proportion, and there's some angularity to them.
Okay, next. Okay, now, tell us what these photographs are of, where did these come from?
These are images that I took at a homicide scene in the state of New York. Right. Essentially, we were asked to come and assist, mutual aid, similar to the different agencies here helping one another. By going to New York, we had certain things that maybe their laboratory or their crime scene unit didn't have access to.
So tell me what the difference is.
Well, the two photographs show a kitchen area. On the right-hand side, you have what looks like a kitchen, right, a sink. And if you look directly down on the floor, there's kind of a reddish stain that you can barely see. By using various chemical processing methods, as well as photo documentation, right, the picture on the left, I was able to bring up a lot more footprints that were occult or latent. They were kind of invisible, just in very light blood residue. And the screening test that we use to try to develop those, right, reacts with the proteins that are in blood and causes a color change so that now they're more visible, even if you couldn't see that area in the beginning, right? Similar to a latent print that's invisible when you touch the surface.
And what's a latent print?
It could be a footprint, it could be a fingerprint, but it's whatever residue is there that's left on a surface that you can't normally see without some type of enhancement.
Okay, and so you participated in putting the chemical on the floor here?
I put the chemical on the floor.
And what was it?
It was orthoethylidene.
Say that again?
Orthoethylidene.
Okay. And what year was this? Approximately.
Mid-'80s.
In the 80s. So this is not some newfound chemical. It's been around for 40 years. Okay. And this is what y'all were doing in the 80s?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so did you just spray it on the floor? How do you apply it to the floor?
It's sprayed with an aerosol, very similar to misting from a deodorant can or hairspray.
Okay. And how long does it take to raise these previously invisible footprints?
Almost instantaneous.
And so once those are raised, what's the next step?
If we go to the next slide.
Next slide.
Basically setting up the tripod, the camera, right, to do photo documentation. The other option is literally to cut the sections out of the floor or counter or whatever the imprint or impression's on and take that with you.
Did you just take photographs or did you cut up the floor?
We relied on photographs in this case.
Okay. And this is a tripod we see, so you're shooting straight down on the image?
Yes, sir.
Okay, next. And what is that?
That's an example of what the footprint actually looked like after enhancement. Any of the bluish, greenish areas were not visible right in the beginning.
So wherever we see blue or green here, you couldn't see that on the print on the floor, but once you did this, what had previously been invisible was now visible.
Correct.
Okay.
Photographs would have been taken before the spray and then after.
Next. And what is this?
Again, it's an example of a partial footprint or two. In this case, it's actually on plywood, and it appears to be in a blood-like substance. The scale is there just for size and measurement.
The scale is important. Right, next. What is that?
This is after enhancement,
Okay,
after applying the same chemical.
Go back. Forward. So, again, you applied that same, what was the name of that chemical?
Orthoethylidene.
We've heard some testimony about something called LCV. Is that the same thing or similar?
It's similar. It's a protein dye stain, and there's several others.
And would it raise, if you sprayed it like this and took, would it raise the
It
imprint?
could.
Would it do the same thing?
Quite possibly. Each one of the reagents has a sensitivity level. Some are more sensitive than others.
And you don't use LCV?
We've used LCV, we've used amido black, we've used phenolphthalein. Right?
Okay.
So there's any number of options, and a lot of it has to do with the color. You want to have something different than the background color so that you have contrast. And that's the other part about photography. You need contrast to see something.
So like LCV, I think, turns things
Purplish.
purple. So if you have dark background, you would not want to use LCV.
Most probably, yes.
Okay. Next. Is that it? Okay. What time is it? Your Honor, it's 4 minutes till 1. This might be a good time to break.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will recess until 2:15. Please do not discuss the case.